When 58-year-old Samuel Garrison stepped off that dusty train in Clearwater Valley, he never imagined his mail-order marriage would end in gunfire. The widow who'd written him those gentle letters took one look at his weathered face and said, "You're older than I expected." But age doesn't measure a man's worth, and when outlaws came for her ranch, this old soldier proved he had one last battle in him. Before we begin, drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday, slipping through the mail slot of Samuel Garrison's rented room like a whisper from another world. He'd been standing by the window, watching the gray streets of Boise fill with rain when he heard the soft thud against the floorboards. For a moment, he didn't move. In 58 years of living, Samuel had learned that unexpected things rarely brought good news. But loneliness is a powerful thing. It had been gnawing at him for 3 years, ever since Martha passed, leaving their small house feeling like a mausoleum. His children had scattered east after the war, pursuing opportunities he'd fought to give them but could never claim for himself. And so, on that rainy Tuesday, Samuel bent down with a grunt that reminded him of every one of his years and picked up the envelope. The paper was cream-colored, good quality. The handwriting was neat, measured, feminine. He turned it over twice before opening it, studying the return address. Lydia Burke, Clearwater Valley, Idaho Territory. Dear Mr. Garrison, I hope this letter finds you in good health and spirits. My name is Lydia Burke, and I am a widow of 3 years with a 16-year-old son. I run a cattle ranch in Clearwater Valley with the help of 2 hired hands, but the work is hard and the nights are harder. I saw your notice in the matrimonial news that you are seeking companionship in your later years, that you are a man of steady character and quiet habits. I am not looking for passion or romance, Mr. Garrison. Those things belong to youth, and we have both left youth behind. What I need is partnership, a kind man who can share the burden of this land and the silence of these rooms. Someone who understands that love can be built slowly, like a house, board by board. If this interests you, please write back. Tell me about yourself, not the parts that sound impressive, but the true parts. I've had enough of pretense to last a lifetime. Respectfully, Lydia Burke. Samuel read it 3 times that evening, each time finding something new to consider. The honesty appealed to him. No flowery promises, no desperate pleas, just a straightforward proposition from someone who seemed as tired of being alone as he was. He wrote back that same night, his hand cramping around the pen as he struggled to put 20 years of solitude into words. He told her about Martha, about the consumption that had taken her so slowly he'd watched her fade like a photograph left in the sun. He told her about his children, James in Philadelphia, working for a law firm, and Catherine in New York, married to a banker. He told her about the war, though he kept the worst parts to himself. Some things didn't need to be shared in a letter to a stranger. What he didn't tell her, not directly, was how old he felt, how his knees ached when it rained, how his hands sometimes trembled when he tried to button his shirt, how he'd look in the mirror and wonder when his father's face had replaced his own. The correspondence continued through the winter, letters traveling back and forth across the Idaho Territory, each one revealing a little more. Lydia wrote about her late husband, a good man who died suddenly when a horse kicked him in the chest. She wrote about her son Thomas, who was growing wild without a father's guidance. She wrote about the ranch, 200 acres of stubborn land that demanded everything and gave back just enough to keep you hoping. Samuel wrote about his years as a Union soldier, though he spoke of brotherhood and duty rather than blood and horror. He wrote about his work as a carpenter, his hands that had once built furniture and homes now too stiff for fine detail. He wrote about his dreams of a quieter life, though he wondered if, at 58, he'd simply run out of ambition. By March, they'd reached an understanding. Lydia sent him train fare and a simple note. "If you're still willing, I'm ready. Come in April when the roads are clear." The decision should have been harder than it was. Samuel spent exactly 1 night debating with himself before packing his few belongings into a battered trunk. His landlady, Mrs. Henderson, had clucked her tongue when he told her, "A mail-order bride at your age, Samuel? Have you lost your senses?" "I think I'm trying to find them again," he'd replied. The train ride west took 4 days, each mile carrying him further from everything familiar. He'd fought in the war, buried a wife, raised children, and built half the furniture in Boise, But sitting in that rattling train car watching the landscape transform from city to wilderness, Samuel felt like a boy leaving home for the first time. The other passengers paid him little mind. A young couple honeymooning in the seats across from him, so wrapped up in each other they might as well have been alone in the world. A traveling salesman who slept most of the journey, his case of samples tucked under his seat. A stern-faced woman with two small children who spent the entire trip trying to keep them from wreaking havoc. Samuel watched the country roll past his window. Mountains gave way to high desert, then to rolling hills covered in sagebrush. He saw elk grazing in the distance, their antlers catching the morning light. He saw abandoned homesteads, their dreams crumbled into weathered wood. He saw a land that was still being born, still deciding what it wanted to become. At night, unable to sleep, he would pull out Lydia's letters and read them again by the dim coach light. He tried to form a picture of her from her words. Strong, certainly. Practical. Someone who'd learned to endure. But there were moments in her letters, brief glimpses, of something else. A comment about how the sunrise over the mountains made her forget her troubles. A mention of her son's laugh when they'd watched a new calf being born. Small windows into a woman who still believed life held beauty, even if it also held hardship. The train pulled into Clearwater Valley on a Wednesday afternoon, the sun already beginning its descent toward the jagged line of mountains to the west. Samuel gathered his trunk and his courage, stepping down onto the platform with the careful movements of a man who'd learned not to trust his body completely. The town was smaller than he'd imagined. A main street with a general store, a saloon, a bank, and a church. A handful of houses scattered around like seeds thrown by a careless hand. And there, standing beside a wagon at the edge of the platform, was a woman who could only be Lydia Burke. She was younger than he'd expected. Not young, probably in her early 40s, but younger than the mental picture he'd constructed from her letters. Her hair was dark brown with threads of gray, pulled back in a practical bun. She wore a simple dress of blue cotton, with a man's work jacket thrown over it against the spring chill. Her face was tanned from outdoor work, with lines around her eyes that spoke of squinting into sun and wind. But it was her eyes that caught him. They were clear, direct, assessing. The eyes of someone who'd learned to measure worth quickly and accurately. Samuel approached slowly, his trunk feeling heavier with each step. When he was a few feet away, he set it down and removed his hat. "Mrs. Burke?" She studied him for a long moment, and he could see the calculations happening behind those clear eyes. He knew what she was seeing, a tall man, still straight-backed from his military years, but with gray hair and a face mapped with lines. Hands that trembled slightly as he held his hat, the unmistakable marks of age that his letters had somehow failed to convey. "You're older than your letters made you sound," she said finally, her voice level and without accusation. Samuel felt something in his chest tighten. This was the moment. He could make excuses, could try to explain, could turn defensive, but he'd lived too long for games. "Ma'am," he said quietly, meeting her gaze directly, "the years have taken my strength, not my heart." For a moment, nothing moved. The wind rustled through the sagebrush beyond the platform. Somewhere a dog barked. The train hissed steam as it prepared to continue its journey west. Then Lydia's expression shifted, just slightly. Not a smile exactly, but a softening. "Well," she said, "I suppose we'll find out if that's enough." She turned to the wagon, gesturing for him to follow. "Put your trunk in the back. The ranch is an hour's ride." Samuel lifted his trunk, feeling his back protest, and settled it in the wagon bed. He climbed up onto the bench seat beside her, his joints creaking like old hinges. Lydia clicked her tongue, and the horse started forward without any more ceremony. They rode in silence for the first few minutes, the town falling away behind them. The road, barely more than a wagon track, wound through open country. The grass was just beginning to green up from the winter brown, and wildflowers dotted the hillsides in splashes of yellow and purple. "It's beautiful country," Samuel offered finally. "It is," Lydia agreed, "and it's hard. The winters are brutal, the summers are dry, the cattle get sick, the predators get bold, and the work never stops." She glanced at him sideways. "In your letters, you mentioned carpentry. Can you still swing a hammer?" "Not as well as I used to," he admitted. "But I can manage most repairs. I'm better with planning and problem solving than with heavy labor these days." "That's honest, at least." She guided the horse around a rough patch in the road. Thomas, my son, he's at that age where he thinks he knows everything and respects nothing. He wasn't thrilled about me sending for a husband, especially one who... She trailed off. One who could be his grandfather, Samuel finished for her. I wasn't going to put it that bluntly. I'm too old for gentle phrasing, Mrs. Burke. Say what needs saying. She smiled at that, a real smile that changed her whole face. All right then. Yes. Thomas thinks I've lost my mind bringing an old man to the ranch. He thinks you'll be useless, that you'll slow us down, that this is some romantic foolishness on my part. And what do you think? Lydia was quiet for a moment, considering. I think age is just one measure of a person. I think my late husband was young and strong, and he still ended up dying and leaving me to run this place alone. I think youth doesn't guarantee anything except arrogance. She looked at him again. And I think a man who's honest about his limitations is worth more than a man who's too proud to admit them. Something in Samuel's chest loosened at those words. Your letters, he said. They weren't looking for a farmhand. They were looking for a partner. Exactly. Lydia's voice was firm. I can hire hands for heavy work. God knows I've done it for 3 years. What I need is someone who can think, who can plan, who can help me manage this place with wisdom instead of just muscle. Someone who... She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. Someone who understands that building a life together is different from falling in love. Love might come later, or it might not, but partnership, that we can build deliberately. I understand that, Samuel said. I love my first wife. Martha and I grew up together, married young. That kind of love, the young kind, it's not something that comes twice, but respect, companionship, shared purpose. Those are different things. Those are choices you make. Good, Lydia nodded. Then we understand each other. The ranch came into view as they crested a hill. Samuel's first impression was of competence. Everything was weathered but well maintained. The main house was a solid 2-story structure with a wide porch. The barn stood square and straight, recently painted. Corrals held a dozen horses, and beyond them, cattle dotted the hills in small groups. But he also saw the things that needed doing. A section of fence leaning at an angle. Shutters on the house that hung crooked. A pile of lumber near the barn that looked like the remains of some abandoned project. A teenage boy emerged from the barn as they pulled up. He was tall and rangy, with his mother's dark hair and a permanent scowl carved into his young face. He looked at Samuel with barely concealed contempt. So this is him, Thomas said. It wasn't a question. Thomas, Lydia said sharply, help Mr. Garrison with his trunk. He can't manage it himself? The boy's voice dripped with sarcasm. Samuel climbed down from the wagon carefully, feeling every one of his 58 years in his stiff legs. I can manage, he said quietly, but I appreciate any help offered. Thomas stared at him for a long moment, then grabbed the trunk and hauled it out of the wagon with deliberate roughness, letting it thud into the dirt. Welcome to paradise, Grandpa. That's enough, Lydia snapped, but Thomas was already walking away, his shoulders stiff with teenage defiance. Samuel bent to pick up his trunk, and Lydia touched his arm. Leave it. One of the hands will bring it in. Come inside. I'll show you where you'll be staying. The house was clean and simply furnished. Practical, like everything else about Lydia. She led him upstairs to a small bedroom at the back. This was my husband's room, she said, not looking at him. After he died, I moved to the front bedroom. I thought it would be easier to have separate rooms at first, until we know each other better. That's sensible, Samuel agreed, though he could see the vulnerability behind her practical words. This was strange for both of them. Supper's at 6, Lydia said. We eat in the kitchen. There's a wash basin downstairs. She paused at the door. Samuel, Mr. Garrison, I want you to know I'm glad you came. Despite Thomas's attitude, despite the challenges, I think we can make this work. So do I, Mrs. Burke. Lydia, she corrected. If we're going to be partners, you should call me Lydia. Then I'm Samuel. She smiled at that, then left him alone with his trunk and his thoughts. Samuel sat on the bed, a good firm mattress, recently aired, and looked around the room. A simple dresser, a washstand with a chipped basin, a window that looked out over the corrals. A man's room, stripped of personality. He wondered what Lydia's late husband had been like. Young, strong, probably full of dreams about building an empire out here in the wilderness. And now Samuel had stepped into his place. An old soldier with aching joints and trembling hands, trying to prove that experience could substitute for youth. That night at supper, the tension around the table was thick enough to cut. Lydia had prepared a simple meal: beef stew, cornbread, coffee, strong enough to strip paint. Two ranch hands joined them, weathered men in their 30s who nodded at Samuel but said little. Thomas sat at the far end, pushing food around his plate and radiating hostility. "Samuel," Lydia said, breaking the silence, "I thought tomorrow I could show you around the property, give you a sense of what needs doing." "I'd like that." "We've got a fence line that needs repairing before we move the cattle to the upper pasture," one of the hands offered. His name was Jack, and he seemed more accepting than Thomas. "Could use another pair of hands if you're willing." "I'm willing," Samuel said, "though I should warn you, I'm better with tools than with ropes. My rodeo days are long behind me." Jack grinned at that. "Mine too, and I'm half your age. We'll manage." Thomas snorted. "What good's a rancher who can't rope?" "Thomas?" Lydia's voice cracked like a whip. "What?" "It's a fair question." The boy's eyes were challenging. "We don't need another mouth to feed, Ma. We need workers." Samuel set down his fork carefully. He could feel all eyes on him, measuring his response. This was a test, not just from Thomas, but from everyone at the table. Would he defend himself? Would he back down? Would he try to assert dominance over a teenage boy? "You're right," Samuel said calmly. "A ranch does need workers. And I'm not the worker I was 30 years ago. But I've noticed some things today that need attention. That fence near the barn, it's leaning because the posts are rotting at the base. Replacing them will last longer than just propping them up again. The shed roof is losing shingles on the northwest corner, right where the wind hits hardest during storms. And that pile of lumber by the barn looks like it's been sitting there long enough to start warping." He took a sip of coffee, meeting Thomas's glare steadily. "I can't rope like a young man, but I can think like an old one. And sometimes that's worth more." The table was silent. Then Jack let out a low chuckle. "He's got you there, Thomas. That shed's been leaking for 2 months." Even Lydia was looking at Samuel with something like respect. "How did you notice all that in the hour you've been here?" "Old habit," Samuel said. "In the Army, you learn to assess a camp quickly. What's strong, what's weak, what needs attention before it becomes a crisis. I guess I never stopped looking at things that way." The conversation moved on, but Samuel could feel a shift in the room. Not acceptance exactly, but a slight easing of the tension. Everyone except Thomas, who finished his meal in silence and left without being excused. Later, as Samuel lay in his narrow bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch settling for the night, he wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. He was too old for this, too worn out for starting over, too tired for proving himself to hostile teenagers and skeptical ranch hands. But then he remembered Lydia's face when she'd said she was glad he'd come. He remembered the way her letters had felt like a lifeline during those long winter months. He remembered that the alternative was his rented room in Boise, watching the rain and waiting for nothing. He'd spent years believing his useful life was over. Maybe, just maybe, he'd been wrong. The days began to find their rhythm. Samuel woke at dawn, easier now than it had been in years, as if the ranch demanded it. He'd dress slowly, his joints protesting the early hour, then make his way downstairs where Lydia already had coffee brewing. Those early morning hours became theirs. Thomas slept late when he could, and the hands didn't arrive until full light. So Samuel and Lydia would sit at the kitchen table, drinking coffee and discussing the day's work. She'd tell him what needed doing, and he'd offer suggestions based on his carpenter's eye and his soldier's strategic thinking. "The water trough in the far pasture needs work," Lydia said one morning. "It's been leaking for weeks." Samuel had walked past it the day before. "The wood's rotted. We could patch it, but it'll just fail again. Better to rebuild it properly." "That's a 2-day job, at least." "3, the way I work these days," Samuel admitted. "But it'll last 10 years instead of 10 months. Lydia nodded, making a note. These conversations felt like building something together, brick by brick. Not love, Neither of them was naive enough to think that happened on command, but something solid nonetheless. The work was hard. Samuel felt his age in every hammer swing, every fence post dug, every board carried. His back ached by midday, his hands cramped around the tools. By evening, he was exhausted in ways he hadn't been since the war. But there was satisfaction in it, too. The fence they repaired stood straight and true. The shed roof no longer leaked. The corroded hinges he replaced on the barn door swung smooth and silent. Small victories, but they accumulated. The hands, Jack and a younger man named Paulie, began to warm to him. They'd accepted that he couldn't do heavy lifting like they could, but they appreciated his knowledge. When they weren't sure how to approach a problem, they'd ask Samuel. More often than not, he had an answer. "How do you know all this?" Paulie asked one afternoon as Samuel showed them how to brace a weak beam in the barn. "Live long enough. You learn things," Samuel said. "Also, I made enough mistakes when I was young to recognize them when I see them about to happen." Jack laughed at that. "That's the truth. I wish I'd known more old-timers when I was starting out. Would have saved me a world of hurt." Thomas remained hostile. He avoided Samuel when he could, and when he couldn't, he made his contempt clear through sullen silence or pointed comments. Samuel didn't push. He'd raised children. He knew you couldn't force respect. It had to be earned, especially from teenage boys who felt their territory threatened. But he watched Thomas. Noticed how the boy worked, hard but carelessly, all strength and no strategy. How he was quick to anger when things didn't go his way. How he looked at his mother sometimes with a mix of love and resentment, as if he couldn't decide whether to protect her or blame her. One evening, about 2 weeks after Samuel's arrival, he found Thomas in the barn trying to force a bent nail out of a board with a hammer claw. The boy was red-faced with effort and frustration, swearing under his breath. "May I?" Samuel asked quietly. "I've got it," Thomas snapped. "I can see that, but I've also bent my share of nails. Sometimes there's a trick to it." Thomas glared at him but stepped back. Samuel examined the situation, then used a small block of wood as leverage under the hammer. The nail came out smoothly. "It's about leverage, not force," Samuel said, handing back the hammer. Thomas snatched it from him. "I would have gotten it eventually." "I'm sure you would have, just would have taken longer and cost you more skin off your knuckles." The boy's eyes narrowed. "You think you're so smart coming here with all your old man wisdom. My father built this ranch. He was strong and brave and worth 10 of you." Samuel absorbed that, nodding slowly. "I'm sure he was. I'm not trying to replace him, Thomas." "You couldn't if you tried, Grandpa." Thomas threw down the hammer and stormed out. Samuel picked up the hammer, his hands shaking slightly, not from the work, but from the confrontation. He understood the boy's anger. Hell, he might have felt the same at that age. But understanding didn't make it hurt less. That night, he mentioned the incident to Lydia. They were sitting on the porch, the day's work done, watching the sun paint the mountains gold and purple. "He misses his father," Lydia said softly, "and he blames me for replacing him so quickly. 3 years doesn't seem quick to me, but to a boy who lost his father at 13, it probably feels too soon." "I'm not trying to be his father. I know, and eventually he'll know too." She sighed. Thomas idolizes his father's memory, the strong young cowboy who built this place with his bare hands. He doesn't remember the hard parts, the arguments, the failed crops, the debts. He just remembers that his father could do anything. And here I am, the opposite of that. "Here you are," Lydia agreed, "honest about what you can and can't do. It probably seems like weakness to him." Samuel was quiet for a moment, watching the light fade. "Maybe it is. I used to be strong, Lydia. When I was young, I could work all day and dance all night. I fought in a war. I built houses. I thought I'd always be that man." He flexed his hands, looking at the age spots and prominent veins. "It's strange getting old. You still feel like yourself inside, but your body becomes a stranger." Lydia reached over and touched his hand, the first deliberate touch between them that wasn't about work or necessity. "You're still strong, Samuel, just in different ways." He turned his hand over, gently clasping hers. Her skin was work-roughened, her grip firm. It wasn't a romantic gesture, but it was intimate in its own way. A connection forming, slow and careful. They sat like that until full dark, not talking, just present with each other. It wasn't the passion of youth, but it was something, a beginning. The following Sunday, Lydia insisted they all go to church. It was a small community gathering, held in a whitewashed building that doubled as a schoolhouse. Samuel was conscious of the stairs as they entered, Lydia on his arm, Thomas trailing behind with obvious reluctance. The whispers were barely concealed. The older rancher who'd brought in a mail-order husband, the young widow, and the old soldier. Samuel kept his head high, but he felt every judgmental glance like a weight. After the service, people gathered outside. A few were genuinely friendly, welcoming Samuel to the valley, asking about his background. But others were less subtle in their disapproval. "Bit of a May-December situation, isn't it?" one woman said loudly enough to be heard. Her friend tittered. "More like September-December," someone else muttered. Samuel felt Lydia stiffen beside him. Before he could respond, a booming voice cut through the crowd. "Samuel Garrison? By God, is that really you?" An older man pushed through the gathering, 70s at least, with a full white beard and eyes that sparkled with life. He grabbed Samuel's hand, pumping it enthusiastically. "Colonel Peterson?" Samuel was stunned. He hadn't seen his former commanding officer in over 20 years. "Just Charles now, son. Been a long time since anyone called me Colonel." He turned to Lydia. "Ma'am, do you know you've married one of the finest soldiers I ever had the privilege to command? This man carried 3 wounded men off a battlefield under fire. Got a medal for it, too, though he was too modest to ever mention it, I'll wager." Samuel felt his face heat. "Sir, that was a long time ago." "Valor doesn't have an expiration date, Samuel." Charles looked around at the gathered crowd, his gaze sharp despite his age. "I heard some of you questioning this match. Well, let me tell you something. I'm 83 years old, and I've learned that a man's worth isn't in how many fences he can mend or cattle he can rope. It's in his character. And Samuel Garrison has more character in his little finger than most men have in their whole bodies." The crowd had gone quiet. Even Thomas was watching, his expression unreadable. "Now then," Charles continued, "my wife would never forgive me if I didn't invite you all to Sunday dinner. Lydia, Samuel, Thomas, we'd be honored if you'd join us." The invitation was accepted, and the afternoon spent in Charles and his wife Emma's comfortable home was a balm to Samuel's bruised pride. Charles regaled them with war stories, most of which painted Samuel in a far more heroic light than he remembered deserving. "Is that true?" Thomas asked at one point, his hostility briefly forgotten in curiosity. "Did you really carry 3 men off the battlefield?" Samuel shifted uncomfortably. "The war was chaos, Thomas. People did what needed doing. I wasn't special." "He's being modest," Charles said. 2 of those men were twice his size. He made 3 trips through cannon fire to get them to safety. The 3rd time he took shrapnel in his leg. Still has it, I'd wager. "Can't afford to have it removed," Samuel admitted. "It aches when it rains, but otherwise I've learned to live with it." Thomas was quiet after that, but Samuel caught him looking thoughtful several times during the ride home. That night, as Samuel was preparing for bed, there was a soft knock on his door. He opened it to find Thomas standing there, looking uncomfortable. "Can I ask you something?" the boy said. "Of course." "Why did you come here? I mean, really. You could have stayed in Boise, found some widow your own age, lived out your years in comfort. Why take on a ranch and a kid who doesn't want you here?" Samuel considered the question carefully. "Because comfort isn't the same as living, Thomas. After Martha died, I spent 3 years in that room, watching life happen outside my window. I was safe, and I was dying by inches." He sat on the edge of his bed, gesturing for Thomas to take the chair. "Your mother's letters offered something I'd forgotten existed: purpose, partnership, a reason to wake up that wasn't just habit." "But you're so old," Thomas said, and for the first time there was no malice in it, just genuine confusion. "Don't you want to rest?" "I'll have plenty of time to rest when I'm dead," Samuel said. "Until then, I'd rather wear out than rust out." He looked at the boy directly. "I'm not trying to be your father, Thomas, but I'm trying to be a good partner to your mother. That means being here, doing what I can, for however long I can." Thomas nodded slowly, then stood. At the door, he paused. "Colonel Peterson said you were brave, but coming here, knowing people would judge you, knowing I'd make it hard for you, that seems pretty brave too." "Or pretty foolish," Samuel said with a slight smile. "Maybe both." Thomas almost smiled back. "Good night, Samuel." It was the first time the boy had used his name instead of Grandpa, or worse. It was a small victory, but Samuel took it. The weeks folded into each other like pages in a well-worn book, and Samuel found himself settling into the rhythm of ranch life with a steadiness that surprised him. Spring deepened into early summer, bringing longer days and work that seemed endless. The cattle needed moving to higher pastures, the hay needed cutting, and a dozen other tasks demanded attention from sunup to well past sundown. Samuel's body protested daily. His back seized up after hours of bending over fence repairs. His hands developed new calluses over old scars. Some mornings he woke so stiff he had to sit on the edge of his bed for several minutes before attempting to stand. But there was something restorative in the work despite the pain. He was needed here in a way he hadn't been needed in years. His partnership with Lydia was deepening into something neither of them had quite anticipated. They'd approached this arrangement with such practical expectations: companionship, shared labor, mutual respect, no illusions of romance or passion. Yet Samuel found himself noticing small things. The way Lydia's face softened when she watched the sunset. How her laugh, rare but genuine, changed the atmosphere of the entire house. The competence in her hands as she worked alongside him, never asking him to do anything she wouldn't do herself. They worked on the water trough together over 3 long days. Samuel designed the structure while Lydia measured and cut the lumber. They talked as they worked, conversations that ranged from the mundane to the meaningful. She told him about her childhood in Missouri, the daughter of a failed shopkeeper who'd drunk himself to death. How she'd married young to escape that house, following her husband west with dreams of prosperity that had only partially materialized. "Daniel was a good man," she said one afternoon, holding a board steady while Samuel hammered. "But he was reckless sometimes, always taking chances, always sure the next big opportunity was just around the corner. This ranch, it was supposed to be a stepping stone to something bigger. He talked about expanding, buying more land, building an empire." She paused, wiping sweat from her forehead. Then one stupid moment with a spooked horse, and all those dreams died with him. "And left you holding it all together," Samuel said quietly. "I didn't have a choice. Thomas needed stability. The ranch was all we had." She met his eyes. "That's why I wrote to you, Samuel. Not because I was lonely, though God knows I was, but because I was tired of carrying everything alone. Tired of having to be both mother and father, both rancher and homemaker, both the strong one and the vulnerable one. I needed someone who could share the weight." Samuel set down his hammer. "And instead you got an old man who can barely lift half what your late husband could. I got a man who thinks before he acts, who plans instead of just reacting, who doesn't need to prove his strength by taking foolish chances." Lydia's voice was firm. "Daniel's recklessness killed him, Samuel. Left his son without a father and his wife with a ranch she barely knew how to run. You might be older, you might be slower, but you're steady, and steady lasts longer than flash." The conversation stayed with Samuel as they finished the trough. When they were done, it stood solid and true, built to endure. Much like what they were building together, he thought. Not exciting or passionate, but reliable. Built to last. Thomas's attitude had shifted from outright hostility to wary acceptance. He no longer called Samuel Grandpa with contempt, though he hadn't warmed to calling him anything more familiar either. They'd found a working equilibrium where Thomas would accept Samuel's advice if it was offered without condescension, and Samuel learned to let the boy make his own mistakes when the lesson was worth more than the cost. One afternoon, Samuel found Thomas trying to break a young horse in the corral. The gelding was spirited but not mean, and Thomas was approaching it all wrong, all aggression and dominance, trying to force submission rather than earn cooperation. Samuel leaned against the fence, watching silently. After the 3rd time Thomas got bucked off into the dirt, the boy stormed over, breathing hard. "You got something to say, old man?" "Only if you want to hear it." Thomas glared at him, then at the horse, then back. "Fine. What am I doing wrong?" "You're fighting him. Horse doesn't understand what you want because you're just showing him what you don't want, which is him throwing you." Samuel climbed through the fence slowly, his movements deliberate. "May I?" Thomas stepped back, arms crossed defensively. Samuel approached the horse with none of Thomas's aggressive energy. He moved slowly, letting the animal see him, giving it time to adjust to his presence. When he was close enough, he just stood there, not reaching out, not demanding anything, just being present. "What are you doing?" Thomas asked impatiently. "Waiting, letting him decide I'm not a threat." After a long moment, the horse took a step toward Samuel, nostrils flaring as it investigated this strange old man who didn't push or pull or demand. Samuel still didn't reach out. "Patience, Thomas. That's the first thing. Young horses are like young men. They need to feel like any partnership is their idea." Gradually, so slowly Thomas fidgeted with impatience, Samuel extended his hand. The horse sniffed it, then allowed Samuel to stroke its nose. Several more minutes passed before Samuel attempted anything more, running his hand along the horse's neck, then its withers, speaking softly the whole time. "Now, I'm too old to ride him," Samuel admitted, stepping back. "My body wouldn't survive being thrown even once. But you try again. Only this time, remember, he's not your enemy. He's just young and confused and testing boundaries, like someone else I could mention." Thomas's ears reddened, but he approached the horse differently this time. More cautious, less confrontational. It still took 3 more attempts before he managed to stay mounted for more than a few seconds, but each time was progress. When he finally rode the gelding around the corral in a complete circuit, his whoop of triumph echoed across the ranch. "You did it," Samuel said when Thomas dismounted, grinning despite himself. "We did it," Thomas corrected, and the word "we" hung between them like a bridge finally completed. The boy hesitated, then added, "Thanks for not making me feel stupid. We all learn, Thomas. The difference between wisdom and youth isn't that older folks know everything. It's that we've had time to make more mistakes and remember the lessons." That evening at supper, Thomas actually engaged in conversation for the first time since Samuel's arrival. He talked about the horse, about his plans for training it, asking Samuel's opinion on techniques. Across the table, Samuel caught Lydia's eye. She smiled, and in that smile was relief and gratitude and something else he was afraid to name. Jack and Polly had fully accepted Samuel's presence by now. They'd come to rely on his strategic thinking and problem-solving abilities. When a section of the barn roof needed replacing, it was Samuel who figured out how to do it with the materials they had on hand rather than waiting weeks for supplies to arrive from town. When the irrigation ditch kept washing out, Samuel designed a simple but effective system of stones and lumber that redirected the water flow without constant maintenance. "You're like having an engineer on the payroll," Jack said one day, shaking his head in admiration at Samuel's solution to a stubborn gate that kept binding. "Where'd you learn all this?" "War, mostly," Samuel admitted. "Army engineers taught us how to build bridges, fortifications, supply depots, all with whatever materials we could scrounge. Then years of carpentry taught me to see how things fit together, how weight and stress work. After that, it's just applying what you know to what you've got." Polly, who was barely 20 and eager to learn, started following Samuel around like a puppy. "Teach me," he'd say. "I want to know how to think like you do." Samuel found himself sharing knowledge he'd accumulated over decades, not just techniques, but ways of approaching problems. How to assess a situation before acting. How to measure twice and cut once. How to recognize when a quick fix would cost more in the long run than doing it right the first time. "My pa never taught me nothing," Polly confided one afternoon as they worked together replacing rotted boards in the chicken coop. "He was a drunk who couldn't keep his own life together, let alone teach me anything useful. Everything I know, I learned by screwing up." "That's how most of us learn," Samuel said. "The trick is to learn from others' mistakes when you can, so you don't have to make them all yourself. I'm happy to share my failures if it saves you some pain." The younger man grinned. "You got a lot of failures to share?" "Son, I've got 58 years worth. We'll be here a while." But not everything was progress and growing bonds. The town remained skeptical of Samuel and Lydia's arrangement. Whispers followed them whenever they went into Clearwater Valley for supplies. Samuel heard the comments, sometimes meant to be overheard, sometimes not. Jokes about dirty old men and desperate widows. Speculation about what Lydia saw in someone so ancient. Betting on how long before Samuel's heart gave out and left her widowed again. He tried not to let it bother him. He'd faced actual bullets in the war. Gossip should have been nothing. But there was something insidious about the constant judgment, the way it crept under his skin and made him question himself. Was he being foolish? Was he really contributing enough to justify his presence? Was he just another burden Lydia had to carry? One particularly bad day, after overhearing two women in the general store loudly discussing the scandal of their May-December marriage, Samuel came home quiet and withdrawn. He went through the motions of the evening chores, but Lydia noticed immediately. "What happened in town?" she asked after supper, when Thomas and the hands had scattered to their own pursuits. "Nothing. Just talk." "Samuel." Her voice was gentle but firm. "I know that tone. What did they say?" He sighed, suddenly feeling every one of his years. "Does it matter? It's all the same. That I'm too old for you, that you're making a mistake, that I'm just using you for comfort in my declining years." He looked at his hands, age-spotted and trembling slightly from the day's work. Maybe they're right. Lydia was quiet for a long moment. Then she stood and walked to where he sat, placing her hands on his shoulders. "Look at me, Samuel." He did, surprised by the intensity in her eyes. "I don't care what they say. I don't care what they think. I know what this partnership has brought to my life. Do you?" "I hope so," he said uncertainly. "Then let me tell you, in case you've forgotten." Her hands tightened on his shoulders. "Before you came, I was drowning, working from dawn to midnight, never catching up, never getting ahead. Thomas was running wild with no male guidance, and I couldn't reach him through his grief and anger. The ranch was surviving but not thriving because I could only react to crises, never plan ahead." She moved around to face him directly. "Since you arrived, we've repaired more in 2 months than we had in 2 years. You've taught Thomas patience and shown him that strength isn't just physical. You've helped Jack and Polly become better workers. And you've given me—" her voice caught slightly. "You've given me someone to share the burden with, someone to talk to at the end of the day, someone who asks my opinion and values my thoughts, someone who makes me feel less alone." Samuel felt something tight in his chest loosen. "I was afraid I was just taking up space, eating food I didn't quite earn." "You earn your keep a dozen times over, just not in the ways those gossiping fools understand." Lydia's expression softened. "We've both been alone too long, Samuel. We both know that kind of loneliness. What we're building here, it might not be the romance of storybooks, but it's real. It's solid. And it's ours. No one else gets a vote in that." He reached up and covered one of her hands with his own. "How did you get so wise?" 58 years, she said, echoing what he'd told Polly. "I've got a lot of mistakes to share." They both laughed at that, and the tension broke. Later, as Samuel prepared for bed, he found himself thinking about the different kinds of love that existed in the world. The passionate, consuming love of youth that burned bright and hot. The comfortable, familiar love of long marriages that weathered decades together. And this, whatever this was growing between him and Lydia, built on respect and necessity, yes, but deepening into genuine affection. Not passionate, perhaps, but profound in its own way. The summer heat intensified, bringing new challenges. The creek that supplied their irrigation was running low, threatening the hay crop they'd need to feed the cattle through the winter. Samuel spent several days surveying the upper reaches of their land, looking for solutions. His legs ached from the climbing, and his lungs burned from the thin mountain air, but he found what he was looking for, a spring on their northern boundary that could be diverted to supplement the creek. The project would require significant work and some clever engineering. Samuel spent his evenings sketching plans by lamplight, calculating angles and flow rates, making lists of materials needed. Lydia would sit across from him, mending clothes or reviewing the ranch accounts, but there was a companionship in the shared silence that Samuel had come to treasure. "This will work?" she asked one night, studying his drawings. "It should. The grade is right, and if we build the channels properly, gravity will do most of the work. It'll take time and effort, but it'll save the hay crop and give us better water security for years to come." "How long? With all of us working? 3 weeks, maybe 4? It'll be hard, hot work." Lydia nodded. "Then we start tomorrow." The irrigation project consumed the ranch for the next month. They all worked from first light until they could no longer see. Digging channels, laying stones, building small dams and sluices. Samuel directed the work, making adjustments as they encountered obstacles, solving problems as they arose. His body screamed protest daily, but there was satisfaction in seeing the plan become reality. Thomas threw himself into the work with surprising enthusiasm. Samuel realized the boy responded well to projects that had a clear goal and visible progress. Unlike the endless cycle of daily ranch chores, this was something they could complete, something that would stand as evidence of their effort. On the hottest days when the work seemed endless, Samuel would tell stories to keep spirits up. War stories, carefully edited to remove the worst horrors but keep the human elements. Stories of ingenuity and perseverance, of soldiers finding solutions with limited resources, of the bonds formed through shared hardship. "Is that true?" Thomas asked one afternoon, pausing in his digging. "About the bridge your unit built in a single night?" "Every word," Samuel confirmed. "Captain said it couldn't be done, that we'd need 3 days at least. But the colonel bet him a month's pay we could do it in one. We worked through the night with torches, half of us so tired we could barely see straight. But when dawn came, that bridge stood solid enough to march an entire regiment across." "Did you get any of the winnings?" Polly wanted to know. Samuel grinned. "The colonel bought the whole unit drinks and a hot meal, best money any of us never had to spend." I wish I'd been in the war," Thomas said wistfully. "No, you don't." Samuel's voice was suddenly serious. "War is an adventure, Thomas. It's horror punctuated by moments of boredom and occasional flashes of camaraderie. I'm grateful for what it taught me, and I'm proud to have served, but I wouldn't wish the experience on anyone." The boy looked chastened, and Samuel softened his tone. "That said, the lessons of war apply to life. Work together, plan ahead, take care of your people. Those things matter whether you're building a bridge under fire or digging an irrigation ditch in Idaho." 3 weeks into the project, Samuel's body finally rebelled. He woke one morning unable to get out of bed, his back locked in a spasm of pain so intense he gasped. Lydia found him like that, trying and failing to stand, his face gray with pain and embarrassment. "Don't," she said firmly when he tried to apologize. "You're not invincible, Samuel. You've been pushing yourself too hard. The irrigation will get finished with or without you today. Jack and Thomas can handle it. You need rest." She brought him willow bark tea for the pain and spent the morning checking on him between her other work. Samuel lay there, furious with his body's betrayal, feeling useless and old and exactly like the burden he'd feared being. Thomas came to see him at midday, dirt-streaked and sweaty from the digging. "Ma said you're hurt." "Just my back. I'll be fine in a day or two." The boy sat on the edge of the bed, looking uncomfortable. "When I was 12, my father threw his back out hauling a stuck calf out of mud. He couldn't move for 3 days. Made him crazy, lying there." Thomas fidgeted with his hat. "He told me something during that time. He said the hardest part of being a man wasn't doing the work. It was admitting when you couldn't." Samuel studied the boy's face. "That's wise." "I didn't think so then. Thought it was just making excuses." Thomas met his eyes. Thomas met Babt. "But watching you these past months, working yourself into the ground, never complaining, just showing up every day, even though I can see it hurts. That takes a different kind of strength, the kind my father talked about. I'm sorry I can't help with the irrigation today." "You already did help. You planned it, designed it, taught us how to execute it. We're just following your blueprint." Thomas stood. "Rest, Samuel. We've got this." After the boy left, Samuel lay staring at the ceiling, processing those words. It was the closest thing to acceptance Thomas had offered, and it meant more than Samuel could articulate. Lydia brought him lunch and sat with him while he ate. "How's the pain?" "Manageable. I'll probably be able to get up by evening." "Or you could rest another day and not set yourself back weeks." She gave him a look that brooked no argument. "Samuel, you don't have to prove anything. Not to me, not to Thomas, not to anyone. We know what you contribute." "I feel useless lying here." "Then let me tell you what you're doing right now. You're teaching my son that even strong men have limits, that pushing through pain isn't always brave. Sometimes it's just stubborn, that asking for help or admitting weakness doesn't diminish you." She touched his hand gently. Those are lessons his father never learned, lessons that might have saved his life if he had. Samuel turned his hand to clasp hers properly. They'd grown comfortable with small touches over the weeks, a hand on a shoulder, a brush of fingers in passing. But this felt different, more deliberate, more meaningful. "Thank you," he said quietly. for patience with a stubborn old fool. We're both stubborn, she replied. Maybe that's why this works. She stayed with him for another hour, just talking. They discussed everything and nothing, ranch business, childhood memories, books they'd read, dreams they'd had. It was the longest conversation they'd had without work to fill the silences, and Samuel found himself appreciating yet another layer of this woman he'd married. She was sharp and funny, with a dry wit that caught him off guard. She'd seen hardship, but hadn't let it make her bitter. She carried scars but wore them like badges of survival, rather than marks of defeat. By the next morning, Samuel could move again, though carefully. He insisted on at least coming out to supervise the irrigation work, and Lydia wisely didn't fight him on it. He spent the day directing from a chair in the shade and found that his presence, even limited, seemed to boost everyone's spirits. It's like having a general watching over us, Jack joked. Makes us all work a little harder knowing you're there. Or makes you all more aware of your mistakes, Samuel countered, but he was smiling. The irrigation project reached completion on a scorching afternoon in late July. They opened the diversion gate and watched as water began flowing through their carefully constructed channels, spreading out to the parched hayfields. It was one of the most satisfying moments of Samuel's life, seeing something he'd designed become reality, knowing it would benefit the ranch for years to come. That evening, Lydia insisted on celebrating. She made a special supper, chicken fried steak, mashed potatoes with gravy, fresh bread, and a dried apple pie that must have taken hours to prepare. They ate on the porch as the sun set, watching the water sparkle in their new irrigation channels. To the engineer, Jack said, raising his coffee cup in toast. To all of us, Samuel corrected. Plans are worthless without people to execute them. And to stubbornness, Lydia added, her eyes twinkling, because nothing worthwhile gets done without it. They all drank to that. Later, after the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and Thomas had retired to his room, Samuel and Lydia sat together on the porch in the cooling dark. The night was alive with crickets and the distant call of an owl. Stars spread across the sky in a brilliant carpet that you never saw back in Boise with its gas lamps and smoke. I've been thinking, Lydia said quietly, about what we talked about that first day, about partnership and how love might come later or might not. Samuel's heart beat a little faster. Yes? I think it's coming. Her voice was soft but certain. Not the wild, reckless love of youth, but something steadier, deeper maybe. Is that strange? No. Samuel reached for her hand, finding it already reaching for his. I've been feeling it too, like we're building something together that's becoming more than the sum of its parts. They sat in silence for a while, hands joined, watching the stars wheel overhead. Finally, Lydia stood, tugging his hand gently. Come inside, Samuel. I think it's time we stopped keeping separate bedrooms. His breath caught. Lydia, I'm not asking for passion or promises we can't keep, she interrupted gently. I'm just tired of being alone. And I think you are too. Whatever we are to each other, whatever we're becoming, I want to figure it out together, properly together. Samuel stood slowly, his heart full of something he'd thought was lost to him forever. Not the desperate desire of youth, but something warmer and more precious. Companionship deepening into love. Partnership becoming something more. He followed her inside into a future he was still building, one day at a time. The morning light filtered through different curtains now, falling across a bed that held two instead of one. Samuel woke slowly, aware of Lydia's warmth beside him, her breathing steady and peaceful. It had been 3 months since that July night when they'd stopped pretending that separate rooms made sense for what they were becoming to each other. 3 months of learning each other in new ways. The quiet intimacy of shared space, of morning conversations before the world demanded their attention, of falling asleep to the sound of another person's breathing. It wasn't the passion of youth. Samuel's body had long since given up on that particular form of enthusiasm. But there was something deeper here, something that satisfied in ways he'd forgotten were possible. Lydia fit against him like a well-worn glove, familiar and comfortable and right. They'd learned to laugh at the awkwardness of aging bodies, to find tenderness in patience rather than urgency. Some nights they simply held each other, and that was enough. More than enough. He slipped out of bed carefully, not wanting to wake her. His back still gave him trouble most mornings, but the pain had become a companion rather than an enemy. He dressed quietly and made his way downstairs, surprised to find Thomas already in the kitchen, brewing coffee. "Morning," the boy said, and Samuel still marveled at how much had changed in that simple greeting. No hostility, no resentment, just acknowledgement between two people who'd found a way to coexist. "You're up early." "Wanted to check on that mare before breakfast. She's close to foaling." Thomas poured 2 cups of coffee, handing one to Samuel without being asked. Small gestures like this had become routine, each one a tiny brick in the foundation they were building. They sat at the table together, watching the sun paint the mountains in shades of gold and rose. These quiet morning moments had become Samuel's favorite part of the day. Before the work started, before the heat and dust and endless demands, there was just this, coffee and companionship and the promise of another day to get things right. "Can I ask you something?" Thomas said after a while, his voice uncertain in a way that was rare now. "Always." "Do you ever regret coming here? Being honest now, do you ever wish you'd just stayed in Boise, lived out your years in peace?" Samuel considered the question carefully. Thomas deserved honesty, not platitudes. "There are mornings when my back seizes up and I can barely move, when every joint aches and I feel every one of my years, when I think about that quiet room in Boise and how much easier that life was. But regret?" He shook his head. "No, because easy isn't the same as good, and peace isn't the same as purpose. Even with how hard I made it for you at first?" "Especially because of that." Samuel smiled. "You tested me, Thomas. Made me prove I belonged here. That was fair. I was a stranger coming into your home trying to fill a space left by your father. You had every right to make me earn my place." Thomas stared into his coffee. "I was awful to you. You were protecting your mother and your father's memory. That's not awful, that's loyalty. It just needed redirecting once you understood I wasn't trying to replace anyone." The sound of footsteps on the stairs announced Lydia's arrival. She entered the kitchen already dressed for work, her hair braided back, looking between the two of them with a knowing smile. "Am I interrupting something?" "Just coffee and conversation," Samuel said, but he caught her eye and saw understanding there. She knew these morning talks between him and Thomas were important, that something was being built between them that couldn't be rushed. Breakfast was a comfortable affair now. Jack and Polly arrived just as Lydia was pulling biscuits from the oven, and they all sat together to eat and discuss the day's work. The ranch had found its rhythm, with everyone knowing their roles and how they fit together. Samuel had learned to accept his limitations without feeling diminished by them. He planned and supervised more than he participated in heavy labor, but everyone understood his contribution was no less valuable for that. "I was thinking about the winter preparations," Samuel said as they finished eating. "We should reinforce the barn roof before the first snow. And we need to check all the water troughs. Any cracks now will split completely when the temperature drops." "Already?" Polly groaned. "It's barely August." "Winter comes fast in the mountains," Lydia reminded him. "Samuel's right. We start now, or we pay for it later." This had become their pattern. Samuel would identify what needed doing, break projects into manageable tasks, and delegate according to each person's strengths. Thomas had the youth and energy for physical labor. Jack had experience with horses and cattle. Polly was still learning but eager, and Samuel provided the strategic thinking that kept them working efficiently rather than just working hard. The morning passed in steady labor. Samuel spent it examining the barn roof, making notes about which sections needed attention, calculating materials. His body might not be able to do the climbing and hammering anymore, but his mind was as sharp as ever. Maybe sharper, actually, honed by decades of problem-solving and stripped of the arrogance that made young men think they knew everything. He was so focused on his measurements that he didn't hear the approaching horses until they were nearly at the barn. 3 riders, moving fast. Samuel's military instincts kicked in immediately. Something about their approach set off alarms. Too fast, too purposeful. This wasn't a social call. "Lydia," he called, his voice carrying the urgency he felt. She emerged from the house, Thomas right behind her. The riders pulled up in a cloud of dust. Samuel recognized 2 of them. The Sutton brothers, neighbors from the next valley over, hard men with a reputation for being quick to anger and slow to forget grudges. The third man was a stranger, but he had the look of someone who solved problems with his fists. "Mrs. Burke," the older Sutton brother said, touching his hat brim with exaggerated courtesy. "We need to talk about your water situation." "What about it, Mr. Sutton?" "That irrigation system you built this summer. It's pulling water from the spring on your northern boundary." He leaned forward in his saddle, his expression unfriendly. "Problem is that spring feeds into the creek that runs through our land. You're stealing our water." Samuel stepped forward carefully. "The spring is entirely on Mrs. Burke's property. We surveyed carefully to make sure of that." Sutton's eyes flicked to him with contempt. "Nobody asked you, old man. This is between ranchers, not—" He waved a dismissive hand. "Whatever you are." "He's my husband," Lydia said sharply, "and he's right. That spring is on our land. We have every legal right to use it." "Legal?" The younger Sutton brother laughed harshly. "We don't care much about legal out here, ma'am. We care about what's right. That water's been feeding our cattle for 20 years. Your fancy husband comes along and decides to redirect it, and suddenly our stock is going thirsty." "There's plenty of water for everyone," Samuel said, keeping his voice level. "The spring produces more than enough for both properties. If your creek is running low, it's because of the drought, not our irrigation." "You calling my brother a liar?" The third man spoke for the first time, his hand resting casually on the pistol at his hip. Samuel felt his pulse quicken but kept his expression calm. He'd faced down worse than these three during the war. "I'm saying there might be a misunderstanding. Perhaps if we sat down and discussed this reasonably—" "Ain't nothing to discuss," the older Sutton interrupted. "You close down that irrigation by week's end, or we'll do it for you." "That's a threat," Lydia said, her voice cold. "That's a promise." Sutton wheeled his horse around. "1 week, Mrs. Burke. Think carefully about what you want to do." The three riders galloped off, leaving a tense silence in their wake. Thomas was red-faced with anger. "Who do they think they are? We should think carefully, like the man said," Samuel interrupted. "And we should talk to Sheriff Morrison before we do anything else." "Since when do we need permission to use our own water?" Thomas demanded. "We don't need permission. We need protection under the law." Samuel looked at Lydia. "The Suttons have a reputation. If we're going to stand our ground, and we should, we need to do it smart." Lydia nodded slowly. "Samuel's right. We ride into town this afternoon and talk to the sheriff. Make sure everything is documented properly." The ride into Clearwater Valley was tense. Samuel, Lydia, and Thomas took the wagon while Jack stayed behind to watch the ranch. The summer heat was oppressive, and Samuel felt every rut in the road as a jolt to his aging spine. But he kept his discomfort to himself. There would be time for aching later. Sheriff Morrison was a barrel-chested man in his 50s who'd seen enough frontier justice to prefer the legal kind. He listened to their account carefully, asking pointed questions about the spring's location and the exact nature of the Suttons' threats. "You're certain the spring is entirely on your property?" he asked. "I surveyed it myself," Samuel said. "I was a military engineer during the war. I know how to read land boundaries. The spring is at least 50 yards inside the Burke property line." Morrison nodded. "The Suttons have been pushing their weight around for years. They think because they were here first, they have some kind of divine right to the whole valley." He leaned back in his chair. "Problem is, I'm one man with a big territory to cover. I can document your complaint, and I can ride out and warn them off. But if they decide to cause trouble when I'm not around—" "We understand," Lydia said quietly. "We just wanted to make sure we were following the law." "You are. And you've got every right to defend yourselves if they trespass." The sheriff's eyes moved to Samuel. "You were a soldier, Mr. Garrison?" "Union Army, sir. 10th Infantry." "Know how to handle a rifle?" "I do, though I'd prefer not to have to." "None of us prefer it," Morrison said. "But preference and reality don't always align. Keep your weapons close and your eyes open. And if anything happens, anything at all, you send for me immediately." The ride back to the ranch was quieter than the ride in. Samuel could feel the weight of potential violence settling over them like a storm cloud. He'd thought he was done with such things. The war had been over for 24 years. He'd put away his soldier's mindset, or so he'd believed. But old training never really disappeared. It just waited quietly until it was needed again. That evening, Samuel cleaned and loaded both rifles in the house. Lydia watched him work, his hands steady and sure, despite their usual tremor. This was muscle memory from another lifetime, movements ingrained so deeply they surfaced without thought. "You've done this before," she observed, "more times than I can count." He sighted down the barrel, checking the action. "Hoped I'd never have to again." "I'm sorry you're being pulled into this." Samuel looked up at her, surprised. "Lydia, this is exactly what partnership means. Your troubles are my troubles. Your fights are my fights." He set the rifle aside. "Besides, I'm not being pulled into anything. This is my home now, my family, my land to defend." Thomas appeared in the doorway, his face set with determination. "Teach me." "Teach you what?" "How to fight, how to defend this place properly, not just shooting, but strategy. You were a soldier. You know how to think about these things." Samuel exchanged a look with Lydia, who gave a slight nod. He turned back to Thomas. "All right, but understand something first. Good strategy isn't about wanting to fight. It's about avoiding fights when possible and ending them quickly when they're unavoidable. The goal isn't to prove how tough you are. It's to protect what matters and survive to see the next morning." "I understand." Over the next several days, Samuel taught Thomas things he'd hoped never to pass on. How to think defensively about the ranch layout, sight lines, approaches, defensible positions. How to watch for signs of intrusion. How to handle weapons not with bravado, but with respect and caution. Thomas absorbed it all with an intensity that both impressed and worried Samuel. The boy was growing up faster than any 16-year-old should have to. They fortified the ranch subtly. Samuel positioned tools and equipment strategically, creating obstacles that would slow any aggressive approach without looking like deliberate defenses. He established watch schedules, making sure someone was always alert during the vulnerable hours of dawn and dusk. He taught everyone to be aware of their surroundings, to notice things out of place or patterns disrupted. "You're preparing for a war," Jack observed one evening. "I'm preparing to avoid one," Samuel corrected. "Most fights are won before they start, by making the cost of fighting too high for the other side to consider. The Suttons are bullies, and bullies prefer easy targets. We make ourselves difficult, they'll likely back down. And if they don't?" Samuel's expression hardened, and for just a moment Jack glimpsed the soldier he'd been decades ago. "Then we make sure they regret it." The week passed slowly, tension winding tighter with each day. Samuel found himself sleeping lighter, waking at every unfamiliar sound. His war dreams returned, things he hadn't dreamed about in years. The crack of rifles, the smell of gunpowder, the weight of responsibility for other people's lives. He'd wake in the darkness, momentarily disoriented until Lydia's presence beside him anchored him back to the present. "You're worried," she said one night, feeling him tense. "I'm prepared. There's a difference." "Samuel." She rolled over to face him in the darkness. "Whatever happens, we face it together. You don't have to carry this alone." "I know. But I've seen what violence does to people, Lydia. To young people especially. Thomas shouldn't have to learn these things. He should be thinking about girls and horses and what he wants to do with his life, not about defending his home with a rifle. The frontier doesn't give us that choice." Her hand found his in the darkness. "We work with what we have, and what we have is you, someone who knows how to think clearly under pressure, who can teach Thomas to be smart instead of just brave." "Brave gets you killed," Samuel muttered. "Smart keeps you alive." The week's deadline came and went without incident. Samuel didn't relax. If anything, he became more vigilant. In his experience, threats that went quiet were often more dangerous than threats that remained loud. The Suttons were planning something. He could feel it. He was right. It happened 3 nights later, when the moon was dark and the world was reduced to shadow and starlight. Samuel woke to a sound that didn't belong, the creak of a fence board under weight, the soft jingle of a bridle. Years of military training brought him fully alert in seconds. "Lydia," he whispered urgently, "wake the house." Quietly. She was up immediately, understanding from his tone that this wasn't a drill. While she woke Thomas, Samuel grabbed the rifle from beside the bed and moved to the window. His eyes, adjusted to the darkness, picked out shapes moving near the barn. 3 men, maybe 4. They were trying to be quiet but failing, drunk probably, or overconfident. Thomas appeared at his door, rifle in hand, eyes wide. "What do we do?" "Nothing yet. Let's see what they're planning." Samuel's voice was calm, controlled. This was familiar territory for him, even after all these years. The fear was there, but it was a useful fear, sharpening his senses rather than paralyzing him. The intruders were moving toward the irrigation gate. Understanding clicked into place. They were going to sabotage the system, probably destroy the diversion gate, and maybe the channels themselves. Months of work, undone in a night of drunken vandalism. "Stay here," Samuel told Thomas. "Keep watch on the house. If anyone comes toward it, fire a warning shot." "What are you going to do?" "Stop them." He started for the stairs. "Samuel," Lydia caught his arm. "You can't go out there alone. You're old?" He smiled grimly. "Yes, but I'm also the only one here who's actually been in combat. Trust me." He moved through the dark house with surprising quiet for a man his age. Years fell away as old instincts took over. He wasn't Samuel Garrison, aging rancher. He was Corporal Garrison again, moving through hostile territory with lives depending on his choices. He slipped out the kitchen door and into the night. The men at the irrigation gate were arguing in loud whispers, clearly drunk. Samuel could smell the whiskey from 20 feet away. He moved closer, using the darkness and their own noise to mask his approach. "Just smash the damn thing," one voice insisted. The younger Sutton brother. "We should burn it. Send a message." That was the hired man they'd brought last time. "Both of you shut up," the older Sutton hissed. "We wreck the gate. We leave. You leave now," Samuel's voice cut through the darkness, "or you stay permanently." The 3 men spun around, stumbling in their drunken surprise. Samuel stood 15 feet away, rifle leveled, his silhouette dark against the star-filled sky. "The old man," someone sneered. "You planning to shoot us, Grandpa?" "Only if you make me," Samuel's voice was steady. "But understand something. I fought in the war. I've killed men before, and I can do it again if I have to. The question is whether you want to die tonight over a water dispute." "There's 3 of us and 1 of you," the hired man said, his hand moving toward his pistol. "There's 1 of me who's sober and knows what he's doing, and 3 of you who are drunk and stupid." Samuel's rifle didn't waver. "But if you want to test those odds, go ahead and draw. The first one who reaches for a weapon gets a bullet. I was shooting expert in the Army, and my hands might shake when I'm pouring coffee, but they're steady as stone when I'm aiming." A tense silence stretched out. In the distance, Samuel heard the house door open. Thomas and Jack, no doubt, coming to back him up. The odds were shifting, and everyone knew it. "This isn't over," the older Sutton finally said. "Yes, it is." Samuel took a step forward, and his voice hardened into something that made even drunk men recognize danger. "You come on this property again. You threaten my family again. And sheriff or no sheriff, I will end you. I'm too old to waste time on warnings. Touch anything on this ranch, and I put you in the ground. Am I clear?" Something in his tone, the absolute certainty of someone who'd followed through on such promises before, finally penetrated their whiskey-clouded judgment. The 3 men backed toward their horses, trying to maintain some dignity in their retreat. "You'll regret this," the hired man muttered. "I've got 58 years of regrets," Samuel replied. "What's 1 more? Now get off my land." They mounted and rode off, their horses' hooves thundering into the night. Only when the sound had faded completely did Samuel lower his rifle. His hands were shaking now, not from fear, but from the adrenaline draining out of his system. He felt suddenly exhausted, every one of his years pressing down on him like a physical weight. Thomas and Jack reached him, both armed, both ready to fight. "Are you all right?" Thomas asked, his voice tight with concern. "Fine. They were drunk and stupid, more bark than bite." Samuel started walking back to the house, his legs suddenly unsteady. "But we need to keep watch tonight. They might come back when they're angry instead of drunk." Lydia met them at the door, her face pale. "I heard everything. Samuel, you could have been killed." "Could have. Wasn't." He set the rifle down carefully, then sat heavily at the kitchen table. His hands were trembling badly now, the aftermath of fear and exertion. But we need to contact Sheriff Morrison first thing in the morning. This was trespassing and attempted destruction of property. Time to make it official. You were so calm out there, Thomas said, staring at him with something like awe. Like you did this every day. There was a time I did, Samuel admitted. Long time ago. Different war. He looked at the boys seriously. But understand, Thomas, I wasn't brave out there. I was terrified. The difference is, I've had enough years to learn that being scared and being effective aren't mutually exclusive. Fear keeps you sharp if you don't let it control you. They took shifts watching the rest of the night, but the Suttons didn't return. As dawn broke over the mountains, Samuel stood on the porch watching the light chase away the shadows. Lydia came out with coffee, handing him a cup and standing close. Thank you, she said quietly, for protecting us, for not letting them take what we built. It's what partners do. He sipped the coffee, feeling warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the beverage. Though I'd prefer if defending the ranch didn't require pointing rifles at people. Me too. She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her shoulders. They stood like that as the sun rose, two people who'd found each other late in life and were determined to hold on to what they'd built together. Sheriff Morrison arrived by mid-morning, brought the full account of the night's events. He listened gravely, then rode out to the Sutton Ranch with a clear message. The next incident would result in arrests and prosecution. The Suttons backed down after that, their bluster finally punctured by the reality of legal consequences. The crisis passed, but it left marks on all of them. Thomas had seen Samuel in a new light, not just as the old man who'd married his mother, but as someone formidable in his own right. The boy's respect, hard-won over months, deepened into something more like admiration. Will you teach me? Thomas asked one evening. Not just about defending the ranch, but about being calm under pressure, about thinking clearly when everything's going wrong. That's not something you can teach directly, Samuel said. It comes from experience, from making mistakes and learning from them, from failing and getting back up, from being afraid and doing what needs doing anyway. Then tell me your stories, the real ones, not the edited versions. I want to understand how you became who you are. So Samuel began sharing the stories he'd kept locked away for decades. Not the glorious tales of heroism, but the harder truths. The times he'd been terrified. The friends he'd lost. The decisions that still haunted him. The slow process of learning that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. Thomas listened to all of it, absorbing not just the stories but the lessons woven through them. And in the telling, Samuel found something unexpected, a kind of healing. These memories he'd carried alone for so long, sharing them with this boy who was becoming something like a son, somehow made them lighter. As autumn painted the valley in shades of gold and crimson, the ranch settled into a new equilibrium. The irrigation system Samuel had designed kept water flowing even as the creeks ran low. The hay crop they'd saved would see the cattle through the winter. The repairs and improvements he'd implemented over the summer meant the ranch was more secure than it had been in years. But more than the physical improvements, there was a sense of family that hadn't existed before. Samuel had found his place, not as a replacement for Thomas's father, but as something new and equally valuable. A mentor, a partner, a steady presence that made everyone else feel more secure. One cool evening in October, as they all sat around the dinner table, Lydia looked at each of them in turn. "We should talk about the future," she said. "About what we're building here." "What do you mean?" Thomas asked. "I mean this ranch has grown stronger this year than it's been since your father died. We've improved the land, the buildings, the water system. We've worked as a team. And I think we should acknowledge that Samuel isn't just here temporarily. He's part of this family now, permanently." She turned to Samuel. "I want to add your name to the deed. Make you a full partner in ownership, not just in work." Samuel was stunned. "Lydia, that's your land, your security." "It's our land, our security." Her voice was firm. "You've earned it, Samuel. Not just with work, but with commitment. With standing up for us when it mattered. With being exactly what this family needed." Thomas nodded. "Ma's right. This place wouldn't have survived without you. It should be yours too." Samuel felt emotion tighten his throat. At 58, he'd thought his life was essentially over, just waiting out his remaining years in comfortable obscurity. Instead, he'd found purpose, family, and a future worth fighting for. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Lydia smiled. And then kiss your wife. So he did? There at the table with Thomas groaning good-naturedly and Jack and Polly grinning. He kissed his wife, his partner, the woman who'd given him a second chance at life when he'd thought all his chances were used up. The kiss was gentle, appropriate for their ages and the audience, but it held everything words couldn't express. Gratitude and affection, partnership and promise, and yes, love. Not the blazing passion of youth, but something steadier and perhaps more precious. Love built on respect and shared effort, on choosing each other day after day, on building something together that was stronger than either of them alone. When they pulled apart, Thomas was smiling. About time you two stopped being so proper about everything. We're old, Samuel protested, but he was grinning. We're supposed to be proper. You're not that old, Lydia corrected, and proper is overrated. The laughter that filled the kitchen was the sound of family, imperfect, patched together, but real and solid and worth every ache in Samuel's aging body. He'd crossed half a territory to find this, taken a chance on a letter from a stranger, pushed his body beyond what seemed possible. And somehow, impossibly, it had all been worth it. The paperwork making Samuel a legal partner in the ranch was signed on a crisp November morning in the lawyer's office in Clearwater Valley. Samuel's hand trembled slightly as he wrote his name, not from age, but from the weight of what it meant. At 58, he was being given something he'd never expected: true ownership, real roots, a stake in something that would outlast him. The lawyer, a thin man named Cooper Smith, who'd seen every kind of arrangement the frontier could produce, studied them over his spectacles. You understand this makes you equal partners in all assets and liabilities? If something happens to either of you, the other inherits everything. We understand, Lydia said firmly, her hand covering Samuel's on the desk. That's exactly what we want. Walking out of that office, Samuel felt 10 feet tall despite his aching knees. Thomas walked beside them, and for the first time, Samuel realized the boy had grown nearly to his full height over the summer. He'd be taller than Samuel soon, if he wasn't already. Time had a way of moving faster than you expected. We should celebrate, Thomas suggested. Maybe dinner at the hotel? The hotel charges city prices for ranch food, Lydia protested, but she was smiling. Though I suppose this is a special occasion. They ate at the Clearwater Hotel that evening, the three of them dressed in their Sunday best. It was extravagant and impractical, but it felt important somehow, a marker of change, of new beginnings. Samuel watched Thomas navigate the menu with growing confidence, watched Lydia relax in ways she never could at home, where there was always work waiting. This was family, he thought. Not the family he'd been born into or even the one he'd created in his youth, but the one he'd found when he'd stopped looking. The meal was interrupted by Colonel Peterson and his wife Emma, who spotted them from across the dining room and insisted on joining them. Charles was as boisterous as ever, his 83 years sitting lightly on his shoulders. "Heard about your trouble with the Suttons," he said once they'd settled at the table. "Heard you handled it like the soldier you are." "I handled it like a man protecting his home," Samuel corrected gently. "The war was a long time ago, Charles." "The training never leaves you, though, does it?" The old colonel's eyes were knowing. "You can take the man out of the army, but you can't take the army out of the man." "Sometimes I wish you could," Samuel admitted. "I'd prefer not to need those skills anymore." "But you're glad you have them when you do need them." Charles leaned back, studying Samuel with an expression that was part nostalgia, part assessment. "You know what I see when I look at you, Samuel? I see a man who's still useful, still contributing. That's rarer than you think at our age." Emma swatted her husband's arm affectionately. "Don't talk about age like it's a disease, Charles. You're more alive than half the young men in this valley." "That's because I found purpose," Charles said. "Same as Samuel here. Purpose keeps you young in the ways that matter." He turned to Thomas. "Your stepfather is a good man, son. You're lucky to have him." "I know," Thomas said simply, and the words hit Samuel with unexpected force. It was the first time Thomas had called him stepfather, the first time he'd claimed the relationship publicly. Samuel had to look down at his plate to hide the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. The conversation moved on to ranch business, to politics, to the upcoming winter and what it might bring. But Samuel kept coming back to that moment, to Thomas's casual acknowledgement of their bond. It felt like a gift he hadn't known he was waiting for. Winter arrived with a vengeance that year. The first snow came in mid-November, earlier than usual, and it came hard. Samuel woke one morning to a world transformed into white silence. The mountains had disappeared behind walls of falling snow, and the wind howled around the house like something alive and angry. "This is bad," Lydia said, standing at the window in her nightgown, her breath fogging the glass. "If this keeps up, we'll be snowed in for days." Samuel joined her, putting an arm around her waist. "We prepared. We've got food, fuel, and the animals are in the barn. We'll be fine." "You don't know Montana winters," she said, but she leaned into him. "They can kill you if you're not careful." "Then we'll be careful." The storm lasted 3 days. Samuel had never experienced anything like it. The relentless snow, the wind that found every crack and crevice in the house, the cold that seemed to penetrate no matter how high they built the fires. But the ranch held. The repairs he'd overseen during the summer, the preparations they'd made, all of it paid off now. The barn roof didn't leak. The woodshed stayed dry. The animals, crowded together for warmth, survived. When the storm finally broke and the sun emerged, the world was buried under 3 feet of snow. Digging out was brutal work. Samuel tried to help, but after 10 minutes of shoveling, his back seized up so badly he couldn't straighten. He stood there bent nearly double, furious with his body's betrayal, until Thomas and Jack gently took the shovel from him. "We've got this," Thomas said. "You go inside and warm up." "I should be helping." "You helped by making sure we were ready for this storm in the first place." Thomas's voice was firm but kind. "Now help by not hurting yourself so badly. You're useless for the next month." Samuel wanted to argue, but the pain in his back made the choice for him. He limped inside, feeling every one of his years. Lydia found him sitting at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, staring at nothing. "Don't," she said before he could speak. "Don't what?" "Don't start feeling sorry for yourself or thinking you're not pulling your weight." She sat across from him, her own hands chapped and red from work. "You've been doing that since the storm hit. I can see it in your face. You're angry at your body for not being 20 anymore." "I should be out there helping." "You are helping. You planned where to pile the snow so it melts away from the buildings come spring. You figured out the rotation for keeping the paths clear. You showed Thomas how to check for ice dams on the roof. Just because you're not swinging a shovel doesn't mean you're not contributing." Samuel looked at her, this woman who'd become so essential to him. "How did you get so wise?" "I'm not wise. I'm just tired of watching you punish yourself for being human." She reached across the table, taking his hands in hers. "Samuel, you're 58 years old. You've lived a hard life, fought in a war, worked with your hands for decades. Your body has earned its limitations. That doesn't make you useless. It makes you someone who's survived long enough to have a past worth remembering." "I hate feeling weak." "I know, but strength comes in different forms. The boys out there shoveling snow, they're using one kind of strength. You planning and thinking and making sure we don't waste effort on things that don't matter. That's another kind. Both are necessary." He squeezed her hands, drawing strength from her certainty. "What did I do to deserve you?" "You showed up," she said simply. "You took a chance on a stranger's letter. You came here knowing it would be hard, knowing you might fail. That took more courage than most men have at any age." The winter settled in after that first storm, bringing a routine of its own. The ranch work contracted to the essentials: feeding animals, maintaining the buildings, keeping everyone warm and fed. It was a quieter time, with long evenings spent around the fire. Samuel found himself telling more stories, not just war tales, but stories from his childhood, from his years with Martha, from the decades of experience he'd accumulated. Thomas absorbed it all with hungry attention. The boy was changing, Samuel noticed, growing not just physically, but in character. The angry, defensive teenager was giving way to someone more thoughtful, more deliberate. He'd learned to ask questions instead of assuming he knew the answers. He'd learned to listen, really listen, to voices of experience. One evening, as they sat around the fire while the wind rattled the windows, Thomas asked, "What was the hardest decision you ever made?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment, watching the flames dance. Probably deciding to come here, to answer your mother's letter and take this chance. Really? Harder than anything in the war? Different kind of hard. Samuel shifted in his chair, trying to ease his perpetually aching back. In the war, the hard decisions were immediate. You had seconds to choose, and then you lived with the consequences. But deciding to come here, that was choosing to risk everything I had left. My dignity, my independence, my last years of life. I could have stayed in Boise, comfortable and safe and alone. Coming here meant admitting I needed something, needed someone. That's harder than facing bullets in its own way. But you did it anyway. Because the alternative was dying slowly in that room, watching life happen outside my window. At least here, if I was going to fail, I'd fail while trying to build something. Lydia looked up from her mending. You didn't fail. Not yet, Samuel agreed with a slight smile. But the winter's not over. As if to punctuate his words, another storm rolled in the next day. This one was worse than the first, colder, with winds that created snowdrifts taller than a man. They lost a section of fence under the weight of snow and ice, and 2 cattle that wandered into a drift before they could be rounded up. It was the kind of loss that hurt, that reminded them how precarious survival could be out here. Samuel found Thomas in the barn that evening, sitting with his head in his hands beside the body of one of the dead cattle. The boy looked up when Samuel approached, and there were tears on his face. I should have checked on them sooner, Thomas said. I should have. You did everything right, Samuel interrupted gently, sitting down beside him with a grunt of effort. Some things happen despite our best efforts. That's the nature of ranch life, especially in winter. My father never lost stock to weather. I'm sure he did. You just don't remember it because you were younger. Samuel put a hand on the boy's shoulder. Thomas, we can't control everything. We prepare, we work hard, we do our best. But sometimes nature wins anyway. That's not failure, that's just reality. It feels like failure. I know. Every leader feels that way when something goes wrong under their watch. But the measure of a good leader isn't whether they avoid all losses, it's how they respond to the losses they can't avoid. Samuel squeezed his shoulder. We learn from this. We figure out how to prevent it next time. We move forward. That's all we can do. Thomas wiped his face, embarrassed by his tears. Sorry, I shouldn't. Don't apologize for caring. That's not weakness, Thomas. That's humanity. The day you stop caring about the animals in your charge is the day you become a worse person. Samuel stood slowly, his joints protesting the cold. Come on. Let's go inside where it's warm. We'll deal with this in the morning. As they walked back to the house through the darkness, Thomas said quietly, Thank you, Samuel, for not making me feel stupid. You're not stupid. You're human. There's a difference. The winter continued its assault, week after week of cold and snow and endless work just to maintain what they had. Samuel's body suffered. His arthritis flared in the cold, making his hands nearly useless some mornings. His back was a constant source of pain. Some nights he barely slept, the ache in his joints too persistent to ignore. But there were compensations. The long evenings with Lydia by the fire, reading together or simply sitting in comfortable silence. The respect in Thomas's eyes when Samuel solved a problem or offered advice. The gratitude of Jack and Polly, who'd come to rely on his steady presence. The simple satisfaction of waking each morning to find they'd survived another night, that the ranch still stood, that this family he'd found late in life was still intact. Christmas came, and with it a reminder that even in hardship, there was room for celebration. Lydia spent days preparing a feast with their limited winter supplies: roast chicken, potatoes, carrots from the root cellar, fresh bread, and a dried apple pie that filled the house with the scent of cinnamon. They invited Jack and Polly to join them, making it a full house around the dinner table. Samuel had nothing to give as gifts except his time and skills, so he'd spent weeks secretly carving. A new handle for Lydia's favorite kitchen knife, the old one worn smooth with use. A chess set for Thomas, the pieces carefully shaped from different woods to distinguish the sides. Small repairs to Jack's saddle and a new belt for Polly. When he gave them out on Christmas morning, he felt embarrassed by how simple they were. But Lydia held her knife handle like it was precious metal, and Thomas set up the chessboard immediately, challenging Samuel to a game. These are perfect, Lydia said, kissing his cheek. Practical and personal, just like you. I couldn't afford store-bought gifts. These are better than anything from a store, she interrupted. Because you made them. They matter more. Samuel had his own surprise that Christmas morning. A thick wool coat that Lydia had been secretly sewing for weeks, sized to his tall frame and lined with fleece. It was the warmest thing he'd owned in years. And more than that, it was evidence of her care. The hours she'd spent stitching by lamplight after he'd gone to bed. The measurements she'd taken discreetly over weeks. All of it spoke of a love that expressed itself in action rather than words. It's too much, he protested, even as he pulled it on and felt the immediate warmth. It's exactly enough, she said firmly. You're out in the cold checking on things, making sure we're all safe. The least I can do is make sure you don't freeze while doing it. Thomas gave him a gift, too, a book of poems by Whitman that the boy had ordered from town weeks ago. I noticed you don't have many books, Thomas said, looking embarrassed. And you're always telling stories, so I thought maybe you'd like reading someone else's for a change. Samuel was deeply moved. The thought behind these gifts, the care and attention, it all pointed to something he'd begun to take for granted. He was loved here, not just tolerated or appreciated, but genuinely loved by these people who'd become his family. The chess game that afternoon became a tradition. Samuel taught Thomas the strategies he'd learned over decades of playing, and the boy proved to be a quick study. Their games became a nightly ritual through the rest of the winter. The two of them hunched over the board while Lydia read nearby, and the fire crackled in the hearth. You're getting better, Samuel observed one evening after Thomas won his third consecutive game. I had a good teacher. Thomas reset the pieces. One more game? It's late. Don't you have to be up early? So do you. Come on, one more. Samuel smiled and nodded. These moments, quiet and simple as they were, felt as valuable as anything he'd experienced in his life. He was teaching this boy not just chess, but patience, strategy, the ability to think several moves ahead. And Thomas was teaching him something too, that it was never too late to be needed, to matter, to make a difference in someone's life. As January gave way to February, Samuel caught a cold that settled deep in his chest. At his age, such things were dangerous. He tried to hide it at first, not wanting to worry anyone, but Lydia noticed immediately. You're going to bed, she announced after hearing him cough for the 10th time during breakfast. I'm fine. There's work. The work will wait. You're going to bed before this turns into pneumonia. Her tone left no room for argument. Thomas and Jack can handle things for a few days. Samuel wanted to protest, but another coughing fit stole his breath and his dignity. He let Lydia help him upstairs, hating the weakness, but grateful for her support. For 3 days, he lay in bed while the cold worked its way through his system. Lydia nursed him with willow bark tea and hot broth, sitting with him when the coughing kept him awake, reading to him when he was too weak to do anything but listen. Thomas visited every evening, updating him on the ranch operations. The irrigation gate froze, but we got it clear. 2 more calves born, both healthy. Jack thinks we might lose some more fence in the next storm, but he's got a plan for reinforcing it. Good, Samuel wheezed. You're doing well, Thomas, handling things. Because you taught me how. The boy looked uncomfortable with the emotion in his voice. Just get better, all right? We need you. Those 3 words, we need you, sustained Samuel through the worst of the illness. There had been times in Boise when he'd wondered if anyone would notice if he simply didn't wake up one morning. Now he had people depending on him, needing him, wanting him to recover. It made the fight against sickness feel worthwhile. He recovered slowly, his body taking longer to heal than it would have even a decade earlier. But by late February, he was back on his feet, though weaker than before. The illness had taken something from him, carved away another piece of his dwindling reserves of strength. You need to take it easier, Lydia said, watching him struggle to split firewood. Samuel, you're not 20 anymore. You're not even 40. You have to accept your limitations. I know my limitations, he snapped, then immediately regretted his tone. I'm sorry. I just hate being useless. You're not useless. But you are recovering from a serious illness. There's a difference between accepting your limitations and giving up. She took the axe from his hands gently. Come inside. Help me with the accounts instead. That's work that needs doing too, and it won't risk you having a relapse. So Samuel turned his attention to the business side of ranching. He reviewed their accounts, made projections for spring, planned purchases and sales. It was work that used his mind instead of his body, and he found satisfaction in it. The ranch's finances had been neglected for years, but Samuel brought his carpenter's attention to detail to the ledgers. He found inefficiencies, identified areas for improvement, made suggestions that could save money without cutting corners. We could buy better breeding stock with what we'd save by switching feed suppliers, he told Lydia one evening, showing her his calculations. And if we time our cattle sales better, sell in early fall instead of late, we'd get better prices. Lydia studied his work with growing appreciation. How do you know all this? I managed a carpentry business for 15 years. Same principles apply. Buy smart, sell at the right time, don't waste resources on things that don't return value. He tapped the ledger. Your late husband built this ranch, but he wasn't great at the business side. You've been maintaining it, but we could make it thrive with some strategic thinking. Show me, she said, pulling her chair closer to his. Teach me what you see. They spent hours going over the accounts, Samuel explaining his reasoning, Lydia asking sharp questions and adding her own insights. It was another form of partnership, different from the physical labor but equally important. They were building something together, not just maintaining what existed but actively improving it. March arrived with the first hints of thaw. The snow began to retreat, revealing the damage winter had inflicted. Fences down, a corner of the barn roof damaged by ice, equipment that needed repair after months of cold. But underneath the destruction was earth preparing to come alive again. Samuel could smell it in the air, the promise of spring, of renewal, of another chance. His 59th birthday came and went without fanfare. He didn't mention it, but Lydia had noted the date from their marriage documents. She made his favorite meal, beef stew with dumplings, and produced a small cake that must have taken precious sugar and eggs. You shouldn't have, Samuel said, genuinely touched. You've earned celebration. She cut him a generous slice. 59 years and still standing. That's no small achievement. 59 and barely standing, he corrected with a wry smile. I feel like I'm held together with string and stubbornness. Whatever works. Thomas raised his coffee cup. To Samuel, for showing up when we needed him and staying even when it got hard. They drank to that, and Samuel felt emotion tighten his throat again. A year ago, he'd been alone in a rented room, convinced his useful life was over. Now he had family, purpose, a reason to keep going despite the pain and difficulty. It wasn't the life he'd imagined in his youth, but it was a good life nonetheless. As spring strengthened, Samuel threw himself into planning the year's work. They would expand the irrigation system, add another pasture, improve the breeding stock. The ranch had survived the winter in good shape despite the losses, and now they could build on that foundation. But Samuel was realistic about his role. He would plan and supervise, not swing hammers or dig ditches. His body had made its limitations clear, and he'd learned to accept them without shame. There was dignity in knowing what you could and couldn't do, in contributing what you had rather than pretending to be something you weren't. One warm April afternoon, as the valley exploded in wildflowers and new grass, Samuel stood on the porch, watching Thomas work with the horses. The boy had grown so much, not just physically, but in confidence and competence. He was becoming a fine young man, the kind of person who would build on what his parents had created and make something even better. Lydia joined Samuel on the porch, sliding her arm around his waist. What are you thinking about? How much can change in a year? How grateful I am for a letter from a stranger. He pulled her close. How lucky I am that you were willing to take a chance on an old man. Lucky? She laughed softly. Samuel, you saved this ranch. You saved my son. You saved me from drowning in loneliness and responsibility. If anyone's lucky, it's us that you decided to answer that letter. They stood together watching the sun paint the mountains in shades of gold, two people who'd found each other when they'd both given up on finding anything. The wind carried the scent of sage and possibility, of earth warming and life returning. Winter had tested them, but they'd survived it together. And whatever came next, Samuel knew they would face it the same way. Not perfectly, but together. That was enough. That was everything. The promise of that April afternoon carried them into May, and with it came the kind of work that defined spring on a ranch. Calving season arrived in earnest, bringing sleepless nights and constant vigilance. Samuel couldn't do the physical labor of pulling calves or wrestling cattle, but he could watch, and he could think, and he could be there when decisions needed making. He found Thomas in the barn at 2 a.m, exhausted and covered in blood and birth fluids, sitting beside a cow who'd just delivered twins. The boy looked up when Samuel approached, and there was pride mixed with weariness in his face. "Both healthy," Thomas said. "Touch and go for a while, but we got them breathing." Samuel lowered himself carefully onto a hay bale, his joints protesting the hour and the cold. "You did good work here. Your mother would be proud." "You taught me most of what I know." Thomas wiped his face with a relatively clean corner of his sleeve. "How to stay calm when things go wrong. How to think through problems instead of just panicking. You already had it in you. I just helped you find it." Samuel watched the newborn calves, still wobbly and uncertain on their legs. "Your father would be proud too, you know, of the man you're becoming." Thomas was quiet for a moment, then said, "I used to think you were trying to replace him, that Ma was forgetting him by bringing you here. And now? Now I understand you can't replace people. You can only add new ones. My father built this place, and he loved us, and he died too soon. None of that changes because you're here." Thomas looked at Samuel directly. "But you're here, and you matter too. Not instead of him, alongside him, in a different way." Samuel felt his throat tighten with emotion. "That's very wise for 17. 17 next month," Thomas corrected with a slight smile. "And I learned it from watching you and Ma. How you don't pretend to be something you're not. How you respect what came before while still building something new." They sat together in the quiet barn, watching the miracle of new life stabilize and strengthen. When the calves were steady on their feet and nursing, Samuel stood with a groan and clasped Thomas's shoulder. "Get some sleep. I'll watch them for a while." "You sure? You need rest too." "I'm old. I'll have plenty of time to rest when I'm dead. Right now, I want to sit with these calves and remember what new beginnings look like." After Thomas left, Samuel did exactly that. He sat in the hay, his back against the barn wall, and watched life continuing its ancient cycle: birth and growth, struggle and survival, the endless pattern that had sustained humanity since the beginning. He was part of that pattern now in ways he'd never expected, not creating new life himself anymore, but helping nurture it, protect it, guide it toward maturity. The morning found him there, stiff and sore but content. Lydia discovered him just after dawn, still keeping watch over the calves. "You were supposed to wake me if anything happened," she said, but there was affection in her voice, not anger. "Nothing happened. Thomas handled the birth beautifully, and I just stayed to make sure they settled in properly." He tried to stand and failed, his body locked in place after hours of sitting in the cold. Lydia helped him up, her hands strong and sure. "You're going to pay for this later. Your back will be screaming." "It's already screaming. What's a little more volume?" But he leaned on her as they walked to the house, grateful for her support in more ways than one. The spring work continued relentlessly. Fence repairs, equipment maintenance, preparing fields, managing the growing herd. Samuel coordinated it all, his military organizational skills proving invaluable. He created schedules, assigned tasks, made sure resources were used efficiently. The ranch ran smoother than it had in years, not because of any single person's effort, but because they worked as a unit, each contributing what they could. Jack pulled Samuel aside one afternoon in mid-May. "I wanted you to know, Polly and me, we're planning to stay on permanent. Lydia offered us year-round positions with winter pay, said it was your idea." "Made sense," Samuel replied. "You're good workers, and we can use the help year-round. Winter especially, as we learned." "It's more than that, though." Jack shifted his weight, uncomfortable with emotion. "You've taught us things. Not just about ranching, but about thinking ahead, about planning instead of just reacting. I've worked a dozen ranches, and I've never learned as much as I have here. You give me too much credit." "I give you exactly the credit you deserve." Jack extended his hand. "Thank you, Samuel, for taking the time to teach instead of just ordering." They shook on it, two men from different generations finding common ground in shared work and mutual respect. After Jack left, Samuel stood there feeling the weight of responsibility and the lightness of purpose in equal measure. People were counting on him. People were learning from him. At 59, with a body that betrayed him daily, he was still useful, still necessary, still building something that would outlast him. Thomas's 17th birthday arrived on a perfect June morning. Lydia prepared a special breakfast, and they surprised the boy with gifts carefully chosen and saved for. A new saddle from Lydia, custom made by the leather worker in town. A watch from Samuel, nothing fancy but reliable and practical. And from Jack and Polly, a fine bridle they'd gone together to purchase. Thomas was overwhelmed, his eyes bright with emotion he was trying manfully to hide. "This is too much. You didn't have to—" "We wanted to," Lydia interrupted. "You've become a fine young man, Thomas. Your father would be so proud." "Both your fathers," Samuel added quietly, and Thomas's head snapped up to meet his gaze. The boy stood and walked around the table, then did something that shocked everyone. He hugged Samuel hard and tight, the embrace of a son to a father. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything, for coming here, for staying, for being exactly what we needed." Samuel's arms came up to return the embrace, his eyes stinging with tears he didn't bother to hide. "Thank you for letting me stay, for giving an old man a reason to keep going." When they pulled apart, there wasn't a dry eye at the table. Even Jack and Polly were suspiciously bright-eyed. It was a moment of pure connection, of family acknowledging itself without shame or hesitation. That afternoon, they held a small party. Colonel Peterson and Emma came, along with a few neighboring ranchers who'd become friends over the year. The Suttons stayed away, their grudge apparently permanent, but Samuel didn't care. He learned that you couldn't please everyone, and trying to do so was a waste of precious energy. The celebration was simple but joyful. Good food, better company, stories and laughter that filled the ranch house with life. Samuel watched it all from his chair on the porch, his body too tired to participate fully, but his heart full to overflowing. This life he'd stumbled into, this family he'd found, this purpose he'd discovered, it was worth every ache, every limitation, every moment of doubt. Charles Peterson settled into the chair beside him, 2 glasses of whiskey in hand. He offered one to Samuel. "To unlikely journeys that end well." They drank, the whiskey burning pleasantly. "Thank you," Samuel said after a moment, "for what you said at church that first Sunday. About character mattering more than age. It made a difference." "I only spoke truth." Charles studied him with those sharp old eyes. "You know what the hardest part of aging is, Samuel? It's not the physical decline. It's the invisibility. People stop seeing you as useful, as capable. They see your age and dismiss everything else. I know that feeling well. But you fought it. You came here and proved that experience and wisdom have their own kind of strength. You should be proud of that." Charles raised his glass again. "To growing old without becoming useless." "I'll drink to that." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the party. 2 old soldiers who'd found ways to remain relevant in their later years. After a while, Charles said, "Emma and I have been talking. We're not going to live forever, and we'd like to make sure our place goes to someone who'll care for it. We've got no children of our own, and we wondered if Thomas might be interested. In the future, I mean. Years from now, when we're gone." Samuel looked at him in surprise. "Charles, that's incredibly generous. It's practical. The boy's got character, and he's learning from the best. Our ranch adjoined yours on the east side. Together, they'd make a substantial operation, something Thomas could build on, maybe pass to his own children someday." Charles smiled. "We like the idea of our land staying in good hands, hands you helped shape." "I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything yet. Just think about it. Talk to Lydia and Thomas, but know the offer's there when the time comes." Charles stood, joints creaking. "Now I should get back before Emma thinks I've wandered off and gotten lost." Samuel sat alone after Charles left, processing the conversation. The future was taking shape in ways he'd never imagined. Not just his future, but Thomas's, and through Thomas, generations yet unborn. The work he was doing here, the teaching and planning and guiding, it would ripple forward long after he was gone. That thought was both humbling and deeply satisfying. The summer unfolded with the kind of perfect weather that made you forget about brutal winters. The irrigation system Samuel had designed kept water flowing even as the temperatures soared. The hay crop was the best in 5 years. The cattle thrived on the rich grass of the high pastures. Everything they'd planned, everything they'd worked for, was bearing fruit. But Samuel could feel time pressing on him. His body was declining faster than he'd anticipated. Some mornings he woke to find his hands so stiff he couldn't grip a coffee cup. His back gave out with increasing frequency. The cough from his winter illness never fully left, lingering in his chest like an unwelcome tenant. He was wearing out, and he knew it. He didn't mention it to Lydia, not wanting to worry her. But she knew anyway. She always knew. "You need to see a doctor," she said one evening after a particularly bad coughing fit. "I'm fine, just getting old." "Samuel," her voice was firm, "I've watched you decline over the summer. Something's wrong beyond just age." "What's a doctor going to tell me? That I'm 59 and my body's worn out? I already know that." He tried to smile. "Can't fix old, Lydia. But we can manage it, make you more comfortable. Maybe there's medicine that could help." She took his hands, feeling the swollen joints. "Please, for me, let's at least find out what we're dealing with." So they went to town the next week to see Doc Hendricks, who'd been practicing medicine in Clearwater Valley for 30 years. The old doctor examined Samuel thoroughly, asking questions, listening to his chest, testing his joints and reflexes. When he was done, Hendricks sat back with a sigh. "I'm going to be straight with you, Samuel. You've got arthritis that's only going to get worse. Your lungs are damaged, probably from a combination of that winter illness and old war injuries. Your heart's working harder than it should to keep up with a body that's wearing out." "How long?" Samuel asked bluntly. "Could be years, could be months. Depends on how you treat yourself, what kind of winter we get, whether you get sick again." Hendricks met his gaze. "But you're not going to get better. Best case scenario, you slow the decline, manage the pain, make the time you have left count." Lydia's hand found Samuel's, gripping tight. "What can we do?" "Keep him warm and dry. Don't let him overwork. There are tonics for the pain, though they'll make him drowsy. Mostly, you make him rest more than he wants to." Hendricks looked at Samuel with sympathy. "I know that's not what you want to hear, but pushing yourself won't give you more time. It'll just use up what you have faster." The ride home was quiet. Samuel stared at the passing landscape, thinking about time and how it slipped away no matter how tightly you tried to hold it. He'd known, of course, had felt his body failing, but hearing it confirmed, having a doctor put words to his fears, made it real in a way it hadn't been before. "I'm sorry," he said finally. Lydia's voice was fierce. "For what? For being human? For having a body that's lived a long, hard life? Don't apologize for things you can't control, Samuel Garrison." "I wanted more time. To see Thomas grown and married. To see this ranch fully thriving. To grow old with you properly. Not just rush through a few years before—" "Stop." She pulled the wagon to a halt, turning to face him fully. "We don't know how much time we have. The doctor said it could be years. And even if it's not, even if it's months, we've already had more than either of us expected. You came here expecting nothing but work and loneliness. Instead, you found family, purpose, love. I'd say that's more than most people get in a whole lifetime. You deserve better than a dying old man. I deserve exactly what I have. A partner who showed up when I needed him, who helped save this ranch and my son, who loves me despite all good sense." She cupped his face in her work-roughened hands. "However much time we have, Samuel, we'll make it count. We'll make it matter. And we'll face whatever comes together, just like we've faced everything else." He kissed her then, there in the stopped wagon on the road to home, a kiss that tasted of salt and determination and love that had nothing to do with how much time remained. When they pulled apart, Samuel rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Lydia Burke. I don't know if I've said it enough, but I do. More than I thought possible at my age." "I know," she whispered, "and I love you too, not despite your age or your limitations, but because of the man you are despite them. Because you chose to live fully rather than just survive safely. Because you took a chance on a stranger's letter and built a life worth living." They drove the rest of the way in silence, hands joined on the seat between them. When they arrived home, Thomas met them at the door, taking one look at their faces and understanding that something had changed. "What's wrong?" Samuel and Lydia looked at each other, having a silent conversation with their eyes. Then Samuel gestured to the kitchen table. "Sit down, son. We need to talk." They told him everything: the doctor's assessment, the uncertain timeline, the reality that Samuel's time with them was limited. Thomas listened with growing distress, his face cycling through denial, anger, and grief. "But you're getting better," Thomas protested. "You're stronger than when you arrived." "I had further to fall," Samuel said gently. "I'm not giving up, Thomas. But I'm also not going to lie to you about what's coming. My body's worn out. I've lived a long life, and I've got the scars to prove it. Whatever time I have left, I want to spend it well, teaching you everything I can, helping your mother secure this ranch's future, being with my family." "You can't die." Thomas's voice cracked. "We just found you. You can't. Everyone dies eventually, son. The question isn't whether, but how we use the time we have." Samuel reached across the table, taking Thomas's hand. "I need you to listen carefully. You're going to be the man of this house sooner than any of us want. You're going to have to take care of your mother and this ranch. Are you ready for that?" "No," Thomas said honestly, tears streaming down his face. "I'm not ready. I need more time to learn. I need you to teach me. Then we'll use the time we have. Every day, every moment. I'll teach you everything I know about planning and strategy, about thinking ahead, about being a leader instead of just a worker." Samuel squeezed his hand. "You're already most of the way there, Thomas. You just don't know it yet." The next weeks took on a peculiar intensity. Samuel threw himself into teaching with the urgency of a man racing against time. He showed Thomas all his systems for managing the ranch, how he tracked expenses and profits, how he planned projects, how he thought about efficiency and sustainability. They spent hours going over maps and documents, with Samuel explaining his reasoning for every decision. "Why are you showing me this now?" Thomas asked one afternoon as they reviewed water rights and property boundaries. "Because you need to know it all, need to understand not just what to do, but why. That way when situations change, and they always do, you can adapt using the principles rather than just following memorized steps." But it wasn't all urgent teaching. There were also moments of simple companionship, long evenings on the porch, watching the sun set over the mountains, quiet conversations about life and death and everything in between, chess games that lasted hours, punctuated by stories and laughter. One night, after Thomas had beaten Samuel 3 games in a row, the boy said, "I'm going to miss this when you're gone." "Then don't let it end with me. Find someone else to play with. Teach your own children someday." Samuel reset the pieces with his trembling hands. The best way to honor someone who's gone is to pass on what they taught you. Make it live beyond them. "I'll remember everything," Thomas promised. "Everything you taught me. About patience and planning and being steady. About facing fear without letting it control you. About showing up even when it's hard." "Good. Then I'll live on through you in a way, through the lessons you learned and the way you apply them." Samuel smiled. "That's a kind of immortality, isn't it? Not our bodies, but our influence continuing through the people we touched." As summer deepened toward fall, Samuel's decline became more noticeable. He moved slower, tired faster, had days where he couldn't get out of bed at all. But he pushed through, determined to see the harvest, to know the ranch was secure for winter, to finish what he'd started. The hay was cut and stored under his watchful eye. The cattle were moved to their winter pastures according to his carefully planned schedule. Repairs were made to buildings and equipment. Everything was ready as it could be, for another brutal Montana winter. In late September, Colonel Peterson passed away peacefully in his sleep. The funeral was well attended, with Samuel insisting on going despite his weakness. He stood beside the grave of his old commanding officer, remembering the young man he'd been when they first met, the soldier Charles had helped shape into someone useful. Emma pulled him aside after the service. "Charles wanted you to have this." She handed him an old army medal, one Charles had earned for valor. "He said you understood what it meant, what it cost. He wanted someone who got it to have it." Samuel held the medal, feeling the weight of memory and loss. "He was a good man, a good friend." "He said the same about you." Emma patted his arm. Take care of yourself, Samuel. We old ones need to stick around as long as we can. But Samuel knew his time was measured in months now, not years. His body was giving him clear signals. The cough had worsened despite the tonics. His strength was fading like light at dusk, slowly at first, then all at once. He could feel the end approaching, though he didn't speak of it. One evening in early October, with the first frost painting the windows and the smell of Lydia's stew filling the house, Samuel sat at the dinner table surrounded by his family. Thomas, grown nearly to manhood now. Lydia, the woman who'd given him this last precious chapter. Jack and Polly, who'd become more than hired hands. This was his family, gathered around this table in this house, on this land, they'd all worked together to sustain. "I want to say something," Samuel announced, and everyone looked up from their plates. "I want you all to know how grateful I am. When I stepped off that train 18 months ago, I thought I was just looking for some place to die in reasonable comfort. Instead, I found a reason to live." "Samuel," Lydia started, but he held up a hand. "Let me finish. I'm not morbid, just honest. I'm old and I'm tired and my body's wearing out and we all know it. But I want you to know that this year and a half has meant more to me than decades of my earlier life. You've given me purpose and family and love. You've made me feel useful and necessary. You've let me contribute and teach and be part of something bigger than myself." His voice grew thick with emotion. "Whatever time I have left, however long or short, I'm grateful for every moment. You've made an old man's last days meaningful, and that's a gift beyond measure." Lydia was crying openly now. Thomas, too. Even Jack and Polly were suspiciously bright-eyed. "You're not just going to give up," Thomas said fiercely. "You're going to fight. We're all going to fight to keep you here." "I will fight," Samuel promised, "but I also want to be realistic. I want us to make the most of whatever time we have. No regrets, no words left unspoken, no love unexpressed." He looked at each of them in turn. "I want you all to know you matter to me. You've made my life worth living. That's everything." The winter came early and hard that year, as if nature was in a hurry to test them once more. The first major storm hit in mid-November, and Samuel watched it from his bed, where he spent most of his time now. His body had finally made good on its threats, collapsing under the cumulative weight of age and illness and exhaustion. Doc Hendricks came to the ranch when the roads cleared, examined Samuel, and gave Lydia the news they'd both been expecting. "Weeks, maybe a month if he's lucky. Keep him comfortable. Let him go peacefully." But Samuel wasn't ready to go peacefully. Not yet. There was still work to do, still things to arrange, still knowledge to pass on. He insisted on sitting in a chair by the window each day, wrapped in blankets, watching the ranch continue without his physical participation, but under the systems he'd created. Thomas came every evening to report on the day's work and receive guidance for the next. They'd review decisions, discuss problems, plan solutions. Samuel's mind remained sharp even as his body failed, and he was determined to use it fully until the very end. "The north pasture fence needs attention before the next storm," Thomas said one evening. "Which section?" "The part near the creek where the snowdrift took it down last year." Samuel nodded, his breathing labored. "Remember what I showed you about bracing posts in unstable soil? Use that technique and put the materials list together tonight so Jack can start first thing. Weather's only going to get worse." "I will." Thomas hesitated. "Are you in pain?" "Some, but the tonics help." Samuel managed a smile. "Don't worry about me, son. Worry about the ranch. That's what matters now. Making sure everything I've taught you is solid enough to last." "It will last," Thomas promised. "You'll see. We'll make it through this winter and every winter after because you taught us how." "Good. That's good." After Thomas left, Lydia came to help Samuel back to bed. His weight seemed to have halved over the past weeks, his body consuming itself. She settled him carefully, then sat on the edge of the bed, taking his hand. "How are you, really?" she asked. "Tired," he admitted. "So tired, Lydia. Like I've been running a race my whole life and I'm finally allowed to stop." "You can stop any time. You don't have to keep fighting for us." "I'm not fighting for you. I'm fighting with you. There's a difference." He squeezed her hand weakly. "I'll let go when I'm ready, when I know you're all secure, when I've given you everything I have to give." She bent and kissed his forehead. "You've already given us everything, Samuel. More than you know. If you need to rest to stop fighting, we'll understand." "Soon," he whispered. "Soon, but not quite yet." The days blurred together, each one a little harder than the last. Samuel drifted in and out of sleep, in and out of lucidity. But in his clear moments, he made sure everything was in order. He'd written letters for Thomas and Lydia to be opened after he was gone. He'd made final arrangements, simple and practical. He'd said everything that needed saying. On a quiet December morning, with snow falling gently outside and the house warm with fires he would never build again, Samuel woke to find Lydia beside him and Thomas in the chair near the bed. They'd been keeping watch, he realized, waiting for the end they all knew was coming. "There you are," Lydia said softly when his eyes opened. "We were getting worried." "Still here," he managed, his voice barely audible. "Can't seem to let go yet." Thomas moved closer, taking his other hand. "It's all right if you need to. We'll be okay. You made sure of that." Samuel looked between them, these two people who'd become his whole world. He wanted to tell them so much, wanted to give them more, wanted more time. But his body had other plans, and he was so tired. "Tell me," he whispered. "Tell me about the ranch, about the future." So they did. Lydia told him about the plans for spring, about the improvements they'd make using his designs. Thomas told him about Emma's offer of the Peterson Ranch, about his dreams of building something even bigger. They painted him a picture of a future he wouldn't see but had helped create. "That's good," Samuel breathed when they finished. "That's everything. You'll do great things. Both of you." He paused, gathering strength for his final words. "I came here to die in comfort. Instead, I learned to live. One more time, thank you for that gift." "Thank you," Lydia whispered, tears streaming down her face. "For answering my letter, for taking a chance, for loving us." "Easy to love you," Samuel said, his eyes closing. "So easy." His breathing grew slower, quieter. Thomas held one hand, Lydia the other, both of them staying present in this final moment. Outside, the snow fell like a blessing, covering the ranch in white silence. Samuel Garrison drew his last breath on a December morning, surrounded by the family he'd found late in life. He was 59 years old, worn out but not worn down, tired but not defeated. He'd fought his last battle and won in the ways that mattered most. Not by conquering enemies, but by building something lasting. Not by proving his strength, but by using his wisdom. Not by refusing to age, but by making his age matter. The funeral was small but well attended. Emma came, grieving another old soldier. Jack and Polly came, honoring the man who'd taught them to think instead of just work. Neighbors who'd come to respect Samuel despite their initial skepticism came to pay their respects. And at the graveside, as the preacher spoke words of comfort and hope, Thomas stood straight and tall, his hand supporting his mother, exactly the man Samuel had helped him become. They buried him on a hill overlooking the ranch, where he could eternally watch over the land he'd helped secure. Lydia placed wildflowers on the grave, the first flowers Samuel had noticed that day he arrived, and she spoke quietly to the frozen earth. "Thank you for 58 years of living and 18 months of truly being alive. Thank you for showing up when we needed you. Thank you for loving us enough to stay even when it was hard. I'll miss you every day, but I'll honor you by living well, by using everything you taught me. Sleep well, my dear heart. You've earned your rest." Spring came, as it always did, painting the valley in green and gold. The ranch thrived under Thomas's management, using all the systems and strategies Samuel had implemented. The irrigation flowed, the cattle prospered, the buildings stood strong against wind and weather. Thomas married the following year a good woman from a neighboring ranch who understood the land and loved him for who he was. They had children eventually, and Thomas taught them everything Samuel had taught him, about patience and planning, about facing fear with steady courage, about showing up even when it was hard. Lydia lived on the ranch until she was 70, Watching her grandchildren grow, seeing the Burke-Peterson operation expand into one of the most successful in the valley. She never remarried, though she had offers. Samuel had been her second chance, and she'd loved him completely. That was enough. On summer evenings, she'd sit on the porch and talk to his grave on the hill, telling him about the day, about the family, about all the ways his influence continued to ripple forward. And sometimes, when the wind blew just right, she swore she could hear his voice carried on the breeze, still steady and calm, still offering guidance, still present in everything they'd built together. Samuel Garrison had been too old to fight in the traditional sense, but young enough to love one more time, young enough to learn, young enough to grow, young enough to build something lasting. He'd proven that age was just a number, that usefulness didn't expire with youth, that the heart could find new purposes even when the body began to fail. He'd come to Idaho Territory expecting to die in reasonable comfort. Instead, he'd lived, truly lived, right up until his final breath. And in the years that followed, in the strong fence posts and flowing irrigation channels, in Thomas's patient leadership and Lydia's fierce independence, in the lessons passed down through generations, Samuel Garrison lived still. Not the body, which had worn out honestly through hard use and good service, but the man, his wisdom, his character, his gentle strength, those lived on in everyone he'd touched. And on quiet mornings when the sun painted the mountains gold, you could almost see an old soldier standing on that porch, coffee in hand, surveying his domain with satisfaction. He'd fought his last battle and won it completely, not with weapons or violence, but with patience and love and the quiet determination to make his remaining years count for something. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all.